Over the next week, Remus began reaching out to his network of contacts from the war years, people he hadn't spoken to in over a decade, but who might still remember their shared experiences and be willing to consider the possibility that justice had miscarried. The responses were mixed, but more encouraging than the official ministry reactions. Kingsley Shacklebolt remembers Sirius from the war, Remus reported, after returning from a clandestine meeting in a London pub. He's an aura now, working directly for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He says he always had doubts about the case, but was told to focus on other priorities when he tried to investigate. Can he help us? He's willing to look at our evidence unofficially, but he can't take action without approval from his superiors. However, he did give us some valuable information about the political situation surrounding Sirius's case. Remus pulled out a notebook filled with his careful handwriting and began reading from his notes. According to Kingsley, there's been significant pressure from certain pureblood families to keep the Black case closed. Apparently, the idea that Sirius Black might have been wrongly imprisoned is threatening to people who benefited from the current version of events. What do you mean? Think about it, Harry. If Sirius is innocent, then someone else betrayed your parents to Voldemort. Someone who might still be alive, still active in magical society, still in a position to cause harm. There are people who would prefer not to have that particular rock turned over. The implications were chilling. Harry had assumed that resistance to reopening Sirius's case was simply bureaucratic incompetence, but the idea that it might be deliberate obstruction by people with something to hide was far more sinister. Do we know who these people are? Some of them, Remus said carefully. Families like the Malfoys, who managed to avoid serious consequences after Voldemort's fall by claiming they were under the Imperius curse. If it became public knowledge that the real traitor escaped justice while an innocent man was imprisoned, it might raise uncomfortable questions about how thoroughly the Death Eater trials were conducted. The Malfoys, Harry repeated, filing the name away for future reference. He'd heard whispers about Lucius Malfoy during their time in Diagon Alley, comments about his wealth and influence, and the suspicions that surrounded his wartime activities. But we do have some potential allies, Remus continued, moving to a more positive section of his notes. I managed to contact Andromeda Tonks, Sirius's cousin. She was disowned by the Black family for marrying a Muggle-born, but she remembers Sirius fondly and believes he's incapable of the crimes he's accused of. Will she help us? She's already started making inquiries through her own connections. Her daughter Nymphadora is training to be an Aura, and she might be able to provide insight into the official investigation process. Plus, Andromeda has connections to several old wizarding families who might be willing to listen to our case. It was a start, but Harry could tell from Remus's expression that building a coalition of allies would be a slow and difficult process. Every day they spent gathering support was another day Sirius remained in Azkaban. Another day, Peter Pettigrew continued his deception. There's something else, Remus said, his tone becoming even more serious. Something Kingsley told me that changes our timeline significantly. What? There are rumors that the Ministry is considering transferring Sirius to a maximum security facility, possibly even subjecting him to the Dementor's kiss. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. The Dementor's kiss was a fate worse than death, destroying a person's soul while leaving their body as an empty shell. The idea that Sirius might face such a punishment for crimes he didn't commit was horrifying. Why now? What's changed? His escape from Azkaban earlier this year has made him a high-priority target, Remus explained. The Ministry is embarrassed that he managed to get out, and there's pressure to make an example of him when he's recaptured. They want to demonstrate that no one, not even someone with Sirius's supposed abilities, can defy the magical justice system. But he's not even guilty. That's irrelevant to the people making these decisions, Remus said bitterly. They see Sirius Black as a symbol of everything that threatens their authority. His innocence or guilt matters less than the political message his punishment would send. Harry stood up abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at the Scottish countryside. The peaceful landscape, dotted with sheep and wildflowers, seemed to mock the urgency of their situation. Somewhere out there, his godfather was running for his life, hunted by people who wanted to destroy his soul for crimes committed by the man currently living as a pet rat. "We have to do something more direct," Harry said suddenly. "All this political maneuvering, all these careful inquiries through proper channels, it's too slow. Sirius doesn't have time for us to convince the ministry to reconsider his case." "What are you suggesting?" Harry turned back to face Remus, his mind racing with possibilities. "We know where Peter is. We know he's living with the Weasley family as their pet rat. Instead of trying to convince other people to investigate, why don't we just capture him ourselves?" "Harry," Remus said carefully, "that's an extremely dangerous proposition. Peter Pettigrew may have been hiding as a rat for 12 years, but he's still a fully trained wizard. If he realizes we're onto him, he could disappear again, or worse, he could hurt the Weasley family to cover his tracks. So we have to be smarter than him," Harry said, the plan taking shape in his mind. "We know things about Peter that he doesn't know we know. We know about his animagus form. We know where he's been hiding. We know he feels safe and comfortable in his current situation. That gives us advantages we can use." Remus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of Harry's suggestion. Finally he sighed and pulled out the Marauder's map, spreading it across the kitchen table. "If we were to attempt something like this," he said slowly, "it would have to be planned perfectly. One mistake could result in Peter's escape, the Weasley family being hurt, and us being arrested as accomplices to a known fugitive." "But it could work." "It could work," Remus admitted. "But Harry, you need to understand what we'd be risking. If we're caught, if something goes wrong, we won't just be dealing with ministry bureaucrats who want to ignore us. We'll be facing serious criminal charges for kidnapping, assault, interfering with an ongoing investigation, and harboring a fugitive." Harry thought about this for a moment, weighing their options. The safe path was to continue trying to work through official channels, hoping that eventually they could gather enough political support to force a proper investigation. But safety came at the cost of time they didn't have, and it meant trusting a system that had already failed Sirius once. "What would my parents do?" he asked quietly. "If they were in our situation, if they knew an innocent man was about to be executed while the real criminal walked free, what would they choose?" Remus smiled sadly. "Your parents never hesitated to do what they thought was right, regardless of the personal cost. James once said that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph was for good people to do nothing." "Then we do something," Harry said firmly. "We capture Peter, we force him to confess, and we make sure the whole wizarding world knows the truth about what happened to my parents." "All right," Remus said, and Harry could see the resolve hardening in his expression. "But if we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. No rushed attempts, no unnecessary risks to innocent people. We plan this like a military operation, because that's essentially what it is." They spent the rest of that day and most of the next developing their strategy. The burrow, where the Weasley family lived, was too well protected and too public for a direct approach. But according to the Marauder's map, the family made regular trips to Diagon Alley for shopping, and the youngest son, Ron, often brought his rat along on these excursions. "The key is to separate Peter from the family without making them suspicious," Remus explained, as they studied maps of Diagon Alley and planned their approach routes. "If we can create a situation where Ron's rat goes missing during one of their shopping trips, it might take hours before anyone realizes what happened. That would give us time to get Peter somewhere secure and begin our interrogation." "How do we make a rat go missing without it looking deliberate?" "Magical accidents happen all the time in Diagon Alley," Remus said with a slight smile. "A dropped cage, a startled pet, a moment of confusion in a crowded shop. If we're careful, We can make Peter's disappearance look like simple misfortune rather than a deliberate abduction. And once we have him, we take him somewhere he can't escape. We force him back into human form, and we make sure his confession is recorded by multiple witnesses with unimpeachable credibility. We can't give him any chance to claim later that his testimony was coerced or fabricated. The plan was risky and complicated, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. But it was also their best chance to free Sirius before the Ministry's patience ran out entirely. "There's one more thing we need to consider," Remus said, as they finalized their preparations. "Once we expose Peter, once the truth about Sirius comes out, our own situation becomes much more complicated." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Harry Potter's sudden reappearance in the wizarding world, especially in connection with such a high-profile case, is going to attract enormous attention. The quiet life we've built here, the identity we've created for Henry Lupus, all of that disappears the moment Peter Pettigrew confesses to betraying your parents." Harry hadn't considered this aspect of their plan, had been so focused on freeing Sirius that he hadn't thought about the consequences for himself and Remus. "Are you saying we shouldn't do it?" "I'm saying we need to be prepared for what comes next," Remus replied. "The Ministry will want to take custody of you. Dumbledore will insist on controlling your education and living arrangements. And every journalist in the wizarding world will want to interview the boy who lived about his dramatic return to magical society." The prospect was daunting, but Harry found that it didn't frighten him as much as it might have a few months ago. He'd grown stronger during his time with Remus, more confident in his abilities and more certain of his own worth. He was no longer the terrified child who had fled Privet Drive in his pajamas. "Let them try to control me," he said with quiet determination. "I'm not the helpless victim I used to be. I know who I am now, I know what I'm capable of, and I have family who will fight for me. Whatever happens after we free Sirius, we'll handle it together." "Together," Remus agreed, and his smile was full of pride and affection. "Always together, Harry. That's a promise." The opportunity they'd been waiting for came 2 days later, when the Marauder's map showed the Weasley family preparing for another shopping expedition to Diagon Alley. Ron Weasley's Dot was moving around the burrow with his usual pre-trip excitement, and sure enough, the smaller Dot labelled Peter Pettigrew was following close behind. "This is it," Remus said, checking their equipment one final time. They had prepared carefully, stunning spells, binding ropes, a portable cage that had been charmed to prevent animagus transformation, and most importantly, a quick quotes quill that would record Peter's confession in his own words. "Are you ready?" Harry asked, though he could see the answer in Remus's determined expression. "As ready as I'll ever be," Remus replied. "Remember, Harry, once we begin this, there's no turning back. Whatever happens, we see it through to the end." "I understand." They apparated to Diagon Alley and took their positions, using notice-me-not charms and subtle disguises to blend in with the afternoon shopping crowd. The Weasley family arrived within the hour, their distinctive red hair making them easy to track through the busy street. Harry watched from his position, outside Flourish and Blots, as Ron Weasley entered the bookstore with his pet rat perched on his shoulder. Peter looked comfortable and complacent, clearly feeling secure in his long-established routine. That security was about to be shattered. Remus had positioned himself near the shop's flu powder display, while Harry waited by the rare books section. When Ron approached the counter to pay for his purchases, Harry quietly cast a minor confusion charm that caused several books to fall from a high shelf. The crash was loud enough to startle everyone in the store, including Peter, who leapt from Ron's shoulder and skittered toward what he probably thought was safety, behind a display of cauldrons. Instead, he ran directly into the stunning spell Remus had prepared. "Stupefy," Remus whispered, and the spell caught Peter mid-scurry, freezing him in place as a grey rat sprawled unconscious on the bookstore floor. "Oh no!" Harry said loudly, rushing toward the fallen rat with obvious concern. Someone's pet must have gotten scared by the noise. Poor little thing. Before anyone could object, Harry scooped up the unconscious Peter and held him gently, making sure everyone could see his apparently caring treatment of the injured animal. "Is that Scabbers?" Ron asked, pushing through the crowd of concerned shoppers. "How did he get all the way over here?" "I think he jumped when the books fell," Harry said sympathetically. "He looks stunned but not hurt. Maybe you should take him outside for some fresh air." "Good idea," Ron said gratefully, accepting the rat from Harry without suspicion. "Thanks for finding him. Mum would have killed me if I'd lost Scabbers." Harry felt a twinge of guilt at deceiving the obviously kind boy, but he reminded himself that they were saving Ron's family from unknowingly harboring a murderer. Sometimes doing the right thing required temporary deception. Ron carried Peter outside, and Harry followed at a discreet distance. Remus was already waiting in the predetermined location, a small alley between Ollivander's and the second-hand robe shop, where they could work without being observed. "Excuse me," Remus said politely, as Ron passed by the alley entrance. "I couldn't help but notice your rat seems unwell. I'm actually a trained healer, specializing in magical creature injuries. Would you like me to take a look at him?" "Really?" Ron's face lit up with gratitude. "That would be brilliant. I was worried something might be wrong with him, but Mum says we can't afford to take pets to the magical veterinarian." "No charge," Remus assured him, gently taking Peter from Ron's hands. "Sometimes these little creatures just need a moment to recover from shock. Why don't you wait here while I examine him? It shouldn't take more than a few minutes." Ron nodded eagerly and settled down to wait, completely trusting in the kindness of the helpful stranger who was offering free medical care for his beloved pet. If only he knew, Harry thought, following Remus deeper into the alley where they'd prepared their makeshift interrogation site. "Finite incantatum," Remus whispered, ending the stunning spell. Peter stirred slightly, but remained groggy and disoriented. "Renovate," Harry added, casting the reviving charm they'd practiced dozens of times. Peter's tiny rat eyes blinked open, and for a moment he seemed confused about where he was. Then his gaze focused on Harry and Remus, and recognition dawned with unmistakable terror. He tried to run. "Oh, no, you don't," Remus said grimly, casting a binding spell that froze Peter in place. "Finite animagus." The forced transformation was not gentle. Peter Pettigrew materialized in the alley, looking exactly as Harry had imagined from the old photographs, short, pudgy, balding, with watery eyes and a weak chin. 12 years of living as a rat had not been kind to his human appearance. "Remus!" Peter's voice was high and wheedling, full of false surprise and manufactured innocence. "Remus Lupin, my dear friend, what a wonderful surprise. And this must be little Harry Potter, all grown up. How marvelous to see you both." "Cut the act, Peter," Remus said coldly. "We know exactly who you are and what you've done." "I don't know what you mean," Peter said, though his eyes were darting around the alley looking for escape routes. "I've been dead for 12 years, remember? Killed by that madman Sirius Black. May his soul rot in Azkaban." "Funny thing about that," Harry said, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "We have evidence that you've been very much alive, living quite comfortably as the Weasley family's pet rat." Peter's face went white. "That's impossible. You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can," Remus said, pulling out the quick quotes quill and setting it up to record their conversation. "This magical device will capture every word you say, Peter, in your own handwriting, and we have multiple witnesses ready to verify its authenticity." "You're bluffing," Peter said, but Harry could see the desperation in his eyes. "No one will believe you. I'm a hero, a martyr, who died fighting against the Dark Lord's forces. You're a coward and a traitor who framed an innocent man for your own crimes," Harry said, his anger finally breaking through his careful composure. "You betrayed my parents to Voldemort, then let Sirius take the blame while you hid like the rat you really are." "Harry, you don't understand," Peter said, his voice becoming even more wheedling. "I had to do it. The Dark Lord would have killed me if I'd refused. I was protecting myself. Protecting all of us, really. Your parents were going to die anyway. At least this way some good came of it. The casual admission of guilt, delivered with such callous self-justification, hit Harry like a physical blow. This pathetic man had destroyed his entire family, had condemned his godfather to 12 years of torture, all to save his own worthless skin. "You're confessing," Remus said quietly, making sure the quick quotes quill was capturing every word. "You're admitting that you were the secret keeper, that you revealed the Potter's location to Voldemort." "I had no choice," Peter said desperately. "You don't know what it was like, being hunted by the most powerful dark wizard in history. I couldn't fight him. I couldn't hide from him. I could only try to appease him and hope he'd let me live." "So you betrayed your friends," Harry said. "People who trusted you, who would have died to protect you, and you sold them out to save yourself." "And when Sirius came looking for you," Remus continued, his voice deadly quiet, "you killed 12 innocent muggles, and faked your own death to frame him for your crimes." "It was self-defense," Peter protested. "Sirius was going to kill me. I had to protect myself. By murdering a dozen people who had nothing to do with any of this." Peter's face crumpled, and he began to sob with pathetic, theatrical despair. "You don't understand what it's been like, living as a rat for 12 years, always afraid, always alone. I've suffered too, you know. I've paid for my mistakes." "You've lived in comfort and safety with a family who cared for you," Harry said coldly, "while Sirius rotted in Azkaban for crimes you committed, while I grew up abused and alone because the people who should have been protecting me were dead or imprisoned." "I'm sorry," Peter wailed. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "But you're not sorry enough to confess publicly," Remus observed. "Not sorry enough to free the innocent man you framed, or face the consequences of your own actions." Peter's sobbing stopped abruptly, and his expression hardened with cunning desperation. "What do you want from me? Money? I can get you money. Information? I know things. Secrets that could be valuable to the right people." "We want the truth," Harry said simply. "The complete, unvarnished truth about what happened the night my parents died, recorded in your own words and witnessed by credible parties. And if I refuse? Then we turn you over to the Ministry, as the escaped criminal you are," Remus said calmly. "I'm sure they'll be very interested to learn that Peter Pettigrew has been alive all these years, hiding from justice while an innocent man suffered in his place." Peter looked back and forth between them, clearly weighing his options. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, I'll tell you everything. But I want immunity, protection, some guarantee that I won't be thrown to the Dementors the moment I finish talking." "You'll get a fair trial," Remus said, "which is more than you gave Sirius." "And the Weasleys?" Peter asked. "What happens to the family that's been caring for me? They don't deserve to be hurt because of my deception." It was the first thing Peter had said that showed any genuine concern for others, and Harry felt a grudging respect for the man's belated attempt to protect the family he'd deceived. "The Weasleys will be told the truth," Harry said, "but we'll make sure they're portrayed as innocent victims of your deception, not willing accomplices. They won't be blamed for what they didn't know." Peter nodded gratefully, then straightened up with visible effort. When he spoke again, his voice was clearer and more honest than it had been since his transformation. "My name is Peter Pettigrew," he said formally, looking directly at the quick quotes quill. "And I am responsible for the deaths of James and Lily Potter, the wrongful imprisonment of Sirius Black, and the murders of 12 muggles in London on November 2nd, 1981. I have been hiding from justice for 12 years, living as an unregistered animagus in the form of a rat." The quill scribbled frantically, capturing every word in Peter's own handwriting. "Tell us about the night my parents died," Harry said quietly. "Tell us everything." So Peter did. In halting, shame-filled sentences, he described his recruitment by Voldemort, his gradual corruption from frightened follower to active collaborator. He explained how he'd volunteered to become the Potter's secret keeper, knowing it would give him the perfect opportunity to betray them when the pressure became too great. He described the night of October 31st, 1981, when his terror finally overcame his loyalty, and he revealed Godric's Hollow's location to the Dark Lord. He told them about watching from a distance as Voldemort murdered James and Lily, about his horror when the killing curse rebounded and destroyed his master instead of baby Harry. "I thought it was over," Peter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought with the Dark Lord gone, I could disappear, start over somewhere new. But then Sirius found me." "He confronted you about the betrayal," Remus said. "He was furious, screaming about what I'd done, threatening to kill me with his bare hands. I tried to explain, tried to make him understand that I'd had no choice, but he wouldn't listen. So Peter swallowed hard. "So I made a choice that I've regretted every day since. You killed 12 innocent people to fake your own death. I cast a blasting curse behind me as I transformed and disappeared into the sewer system," Peter confessed. "I knew the explosion would be blamed on Sirius, knew everyone would assume he'd killed me in revenge for betraying James and Lily. It seemed like the perfect solution." "Perfect for you," Harry said bitterly. "What about Sirius? What about the families of the people you murdered?" "I told myself they were casualties of war," Peter said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I told myself a lot of things to make it easier to live with what I'd done." "And the Weasleys? How did you end up with them?" "Pure chance, really. I was hiding in Diagon Alley, trying to figure out what to do next, when I saw them at the pet shop. They looked kind, normal, like the sort of people who would take good care of a pet rat. I followed them home and made myself seem lost and injured until the youngest boy found me and convinced his parents to let him keep me. For 12 years, Remus said. 12 years you lived with them while Sirius suffered in Azkaban for your crimes." "I know," Peter said, and there were real tears in his eyes now. "I know it was wrong. I know I should have confessed years ago, but I was afraid, and the longer I waited, the harder it became to face the truth." "Well, you're facing it now," Harry said. "The question is what we do next." Before Peter could respond, they heard footsteps approaching the alley entrance. Ron Weasley's voice called out, worried and impatient. "Hello? Is everything all right back there? You've been examining Scabbers for quite a while now." Harry and Remus exchanged glances. They had Peter's confession recorded and witnessed, but they still needed to figure out how to explain the situation to Ron without traumatizing the boy or alerting the Ministry before they were ready. "One moment," Remus called back. "Just finishing up the examination." He turned to Peter, his expression grim but not without sympathy. "This is your chance to do something right, Peter, to finally take responsibility for your actions and help us free an innocent man. Are you ready to face the consequences of your choices?" Peter looked at Harry, at the son of the friends he'd betrayed, and something in his expression shifted. For the first time since his transformation, he looked like a man rather than a cornered animal. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I'm ready." And with that admission, the wheels of justice that had been stalled for 12 years finally began to turn again. The Hogwarts letter had been sitting on their kitchen table for 3 weeks now, its creamy parchment seeming to grow more demanding with each passing day. Harry found himself staring at it during breakfast, during his magical practice sessions, and particularly during the long evenings when he and Remus planned their next moves in the increasingly complex chess game surrounding Sirius's freedom. "You know we can't put this off much longer," Remus said gently, following Harry's gaze to the unopened envelope. They had just finished their morning training session, and Harry's robes were still smoking slightly from an overpowered shield charm that had managed to set a practice dummy on fire. Term starts in less than 2 weeks. I know, Harry replied, though his voice carried more uncertainty than he'd felt in months. The capture of Peter Pettigrew had given them the evidence they needed to prove Sirius's innocence, but it had also complicated their lives in ways they were still discovering. It's just, everything is different now. Peter's confession changes everything about what going to Hogwarts would mean. Indeed it did. The confession they'd extracted from Peter 3 days ago was currently in the hands of Amelia Bones, who had finally agreed to review their evidence after Kingsley Shacklebolt personally vouched for its authenticity. The wheels of magical justice were turning at last, but slowly, and with the kind of bureaucratic caution that made Harry want to scream with frustration. The hearing is scheduled for next week, Remus said, settling into his chair with the weariness of someone carrying an enormous responsibility. If everything goes according to plan, Sirius should be exonerated and released before the start of term. But Harry, even if that happens, your situation becomes infinitely more complicated. Harry understood what Remus meant. Henry Lupus, the quietly talented nephew of defense professor Robert Lupus, could attend Hogwarts with minimal fuss or attention. But Harry Potter, the famous boy who lived, whose dramatic reappearance had coincided with the most significant wrongful imprisonment case in recent magical history, would be under scrutiny from the moment he set foot in the castle. "Dumbledore will want to see me immediately," Harry said, voicing the concern that had been weighing on him most heavily. "He'll want to know where I've been, why I left the Dursleys, how I learned so much magic so quickly. He'll want to control my education, my living arrangements, probably my entire life." "Most likely," Remus agreed. "Though I should point out that Dumbledore's authority over you is much more limited than he pretends. You're not his ward, you're not his responsibility. And now that Sirius is being exonerated, you have a legal guardian who can make decisions about your welfare." "Assuming Sirius wants that responsibility," Harry said quietly. It was a fear he hadn't voiced before, but one that haunted his dreams. What if 12 years in Azkaban had changed his godfather? What if Sirius no longer wanted the burden of caring for the son of his dead friends? "Harry," Remus's voice was gentle but firm. "I've known Sirius Black since we were 11 years old. I've seen him at his best and his worst, watched him make brilliant decisions and terrible mistakes. But I have never once doubted his love for your family. Whatever Azkaban has done to him, that love remains unchanged." "How can you be so sure?" "Because love like that doesn't diminish with time or suffering," Remus said simply. "If anything, it grows stronger. Sirius has spent 12 years knowing that James and Lily's son was alive somewhere in the world, probably believing he'd failed in his duty as godfather. The chance to finally fulfill that role, to honor his friend's memory by caring for you, that's not a burden to him. It's redemption." The words were comforting, but Harry still felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. So much of their carefully constructed new life depended on variables they couldn't control: the outcome of Peter's hearing, Sirius's mental state after his imprisonment, the political fallout from exposing such a significant miscarriage of justice. "There's something else we need to consider," Remus continued, pulling out a thick folder of correspondence. "The response to Peter's confession has been substantial." That was an understatement. In the 3 days since Amelia Bones had confirmed the authenticity of Peter's testimony, their cottage had been inundated with letters from reporters, ministry officials, Old Order members, and what seemed like half the wizarding population of Britain. The Owl Post had become so overwhelming that Remus had been forced to establish a mail sorting system just to manage the volume. "Rita Skeeter from the Daily Prophet has sent 14 letters demanding an exclusive interview," Remus said, flipping through the stack. "The Quibbler wants to do a feature story on government corruption. Witch Weekly is offering a substantial sum for photographs and personal details about your life during the missing years, and that's just the media attention." "What about the others?" "Ministry officials wanting to debrief you about your time away from the wizarding world. former Order members eager to reconnect with James and Lily's son, parents of Hogwarts students concerned about the safety implications of your return, even a few marriage proposals from families looking to align themselves with your fame and fortune. Harry felt his stomach turn at the thought of being treated like a commodity, a famous name to be bought and sold, rather than a person with his own thoughts and feelings. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd hoped to avoid by living quietly with Remus. And Dumbledore? 7 letters so far, Remus said grimly. Each one more insistent than the last. He wants to meet with you immediately, wants to discuss your education and living arrangements, wants to ensure your safety and well-being. His latest letter suggests that your guardians have been negligent in allowing you to become involved in such dangerous situations. Negligent? Harry's temper flared, and several of the letters on the table began smouldering around the edges. You saved me from the Dursleys. You gave me a real education, taught me to defend myself, helped me become someone I can be proud of. Easy, Remus said, waving his wand to extinguish the smoking papers. I know that, and you know that, but Dumbledore sees things differently. From his perspective, we've stolen you away from the protection he arranged and exposed you to dangers he spent years trying to shield you from. Protection, Harry said bitterly. He calls what the Dursleys did to me protection. The Blood Wards are real magic, Harry, even if the people they were supposed to work through failed you completely. Dumbledore genuinely believed you were safer with your mother's relatives than you would be anywhere else in the wizarding world. But he never checked. He never made sure I was actually safe and cared for. No, Remus agreed sadly. He didn't. And that failure of oversight is something he'll have to live with. But Harry, understanding why Dumbledore made his mistakes doesn't mean we have to let him repeat them. You have choices now that you didn't have as a frightened 8-year-old. Harry walked to the window, looking out over the Scottish Highlands that had become his sanctuary. In a few days, this peaceful cottage would be just a memory, replaced by the chaos and complexity of a world that wanted to define him by his famous scar rather than his actual character. What do you think I should do? He asked finally. About Hogwarts? About Dumbledore? About all of it? Remus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. I think, he said finally, that you should go to Hogwarts. Not as the boy who lived returning to claim his destiny, but as Harry Potter, an 11-year-old boy who deserves to attend school with children his own age and experience something approaching a normal magical education. Even with all the attention, all the expectations? Especially because of the attention and expectations, Remus said firmly. Harry, you've spent almost a year learning advanced magic, developing skills that most adult wizards would envy, preparing yourself to face whatever challenges the wizarding world might throw at you. Don't you think it's time to find out if that preparation was worthwhile? Harry considered this. The idea of testing his abilities against real challenges, of proving to himself and others that he was more than just a famous name, did hold a certain appeal. And you'd be there? As defense professor? If Dumbledore accepts my application, yes. Though I should warn you that our relationship will have to be different at school. I can't show you obvious favoritism or special treatment, and you'll need to be careful about displaying the advanced skills I've taught you. Why? Because you're supposed to be an 11-year-old who's been raised by muggles with minimal exposure to magic before receiving his Hogwarts letter. If you walk into your first defense against the dark arts class and demonstrate 5th-year level spell work, it's going to raise questions we're not prepared to answer. Harry nodded, understanding the logic even if he found the deception frustrating. After months of pushing himself to excel, of taking pride in his rapidly advancing abilities, the idea of pretending to be less than he was felt almost insulting. What about when Sirius is freed? What happens to our family then? Then we figure it out together, Remus said simply. All 3 of us. Sirius has rights as your legal guardian. I have the bond we've built over the past year, and you have the right to choose what kind of family structure works best for you. There's no rule that says you can only have one parental figure, Harry." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a magnificent eagle owl carrying official ministry correspondence. Remus accepted the letter with obvious trepidation, and Harry watched his expression change as he read. "What is it?" Harry asked, when Remus remained silent for several long moments. "The hearing has been moved up," Remus said quietly. "Tomorrow afternoon. Apparently there's been significant political pressure to resolve the Black case quickly, before the story leaks to the general public and causes a scandal. That's good, isn't it? The sooner Sirius is freed, the sooner we can start figuring out what comes next." "It's complicated," Remus said carefully. "Yes, it means Sirius should be free within days, rather than weeks. But it also means the timeline for everything else has accelerated. Your return to the wizarding world, the media attention, Dumbledore's inevitable demands for meetings and explanations. Are we ready for that?" "As ready as we can be," Remus said, though Harry could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Harry, I want you to understand that tomorrow changes everything. Once the Wizengamot officially declares Sirius innocent, once the story becomes public knowledge, there's no going back to the quiet life we've built here. Are you prepared for that?" Harry looked around their cozy cottage one last time, taking in the bookshelves lined with magical texts, the practice equipment they'd used for countless training sessions, the comfortable chairs by the fireplace where they'd spent so many evenings talking about magic and family and the future. It had been the first real home he'd ever known, and leaving it, "I'm prepared," he said firmly. "But I want to make something clear before we go back to that world. Whatever happens with Sirius, whatever decisions get made about my education or living arrangements, you're still my family. You're still the person who saved me and taught me and helped me become who I am. That doesn't change just because the situation becomes more complicated." Remus smiled, and Harry could see tears gathering in his eyes. "Thank you, Harry. That means more to me than you know." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the hearing and the inevitable upheaval that would follow. Harry practiced the story they'd crafted to explain his disappearance from Privet Drive, a carefully edited version of events that portrayed him as a confused child who'd gotten lost during a family argument and been found by the kind stranger who became his guardian. "Remember," Remus coached as they reviewed the details, "you don't remember much about your time away from the Dursleys. You were young, you were scared, and the whole experience is mostly a blur of confusion and adjustment to a new situation. Let them assume you've been living as a muggle all this time. What about my magic? They're going to notice that I'm more advanced than a typical muggle-raised student. We'll attribute that to natural talent and the fact that accidental magic tends to be more powerful in children who've experienced trauma. It's not a complete lie, just an incomplete truth." Harry nodded, though the deception still bothered him. After months of honesty and openness with Remus, returning to a world of half-truths and careful omissions felt like a step backward. "There's one more thing," Remus said, as they finished their preparations. "Something we haven't discussed, but that you need to be prepared for." "What?" "Peter Pettigrew is going to be at the hearing tomorrow. You're going to have to face the man who betrayed your parents, who caused all the suffering and loss that followed their deaths. Are you ready for that?" Harry thought about it seriously. Peter's confession had given them the justice they sought, but it hadn't erased the anger and pain that came with learning the truth about his parents' betrayal. The idea of sitting in the same room as the man who had destroyed his family was deeply unsettling. "I have to be ready," he said finally. "Someone needs to speak for my parents, to make sure the Wizengamot understands the full cost of Peter's betrayal. If I don't do it, who will?" "Sirius will be there," Remus pointed out. "He can speak to what happened, what Peter took from your family." "Sirius will speak for himself and for his friendship with my parents," Harry said. "But I'm the one who lived with the consequences of Peter's choices. I'm the one who grew up without parents, without family, without any of the love and protection that should have been my birthright. My testimony matters too." Remus studied him for a long moment, and Harry could see pride and concern warring in his expression. "You're right," he said finally. "Your voice deserves to be heard. Your story deserves to be told. Just remember that the goal is justice, not revenge. Peter will face appropriate consequences for his crimes, but it's not your responsibility to determine what those consequences should be." That night, Harry lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that would change in the next few days. Tomorrow, he would see his godfather for the first time, would finally meet the man his parents had trusted with his care. Tomorrow, Peter Pettigrew would face justice for his crimes, and the truth about the night his parents died would finally be revealed to the world. Tomorrow, his childhood would officially end, and his real life in the wizarding world would begin. The hearing was held in Courtroom 10 of the Ministry of Magic, the same chamber where the most serious criminal cases were tried. Harry had never been inside the ministry before, and the vast underground complex with its bustling crowds of magical bureaucrats was both impressive and intimidating. "Stay close," Remus murmured as they navigated the crowded lifts and corridors. "And remember, you're here as a witness, not as a curiosity. Don't let anyone pressure you into saying more than you're comfortable with." The courtroom itself was a circular chamber with tiered seating rising up on all sides, designed to make whoever stood in the center feel small and vulnerable under the weight of official scrutiny. Harry took his place in the witness section and tried to prepare himself for what was to come. The members of the Wizengamot filed in with solemn ceremony, their purple robes and stern expressions making them look like ancient judges from a fairy tale. At their head was Minister Cornelius Fudge, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings, and Chief Warlock Albus Dumbledore, whose piercing blue eyes found Harry immediately and seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defences. Then the prisoners were brought in. Peter Pettigrew looked smaller and more pathetic than Harry remembered, his shoulders hunched with shame and his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. 12 years of hiding had not been kind to him, and facing the consequences of his actions seemed to have aged him another decade overnight. But it was Sirius Black who commanded Harry's attention. The man who entered the courtroom in chains bore little resemblance to the laughing young wizard from the old photographs. His face was gaunt and scarred, his hair long and matted, his robes little more than rags. Prison had carved lines of suffering into his features and left his eyes hollow with old pain. But when those eyes found Harry in the witness section, when recognition dawned across Sirius's face, something extraordinary happened. The years of imprisonment seemed to fall away, and for just a moment Harry saw the man his parents had loved, the loyal friend who had sworn to protect their son, no matter what. "James," Sirius whispered, and his voice carried clearly across the silent courtroom. "Oh, James, he looks just like you." Chief Warlock Dumbledore called the session to order, but Harry barely heard the formal proceedings that followed. His entire focus was on the man in chains, on the godfather he'd never known but had dreamed of meeting for months. The case itself was surprisingly straightforward once Peter's confession was read into the record. Under the influence of Veritaserum, Peter confirmed every detail of his betrayal, from his recruitment by Voldemort to his cowardly decision to frame Sirius for his own crimes. "I was afraid," Peter said, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. "I knew the Dark Lord would kill me if I refused his demands. I thought if I gave him the Potters, he might let me live." "And Sirius Black?" Madam Bones asked sternly. "What was his role in these events?" "Sirius was innocent," Peter admitted. "He tried to stop me, tried to make me face what I'd done. When he cornered me after the murders, I panicked. I cast the blasting curse and transformed. Let everyone believe he'd killed me, along with those poor muggles." "So you allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned for 12 years, to protect yourself from the consequences of your own crimes." "Yes," Peter whispered. "Yes, I did." The admission sent a ripple of shock and outrage through the assembled Wizengamot. Even in a world where dark magic and betrayal were unfortunate realities, the scope of Peter's deception was staggering. When Harry was called to testify, his legs felt unsteady as he made his way to the center of the courtroom. All eyes were on him, but the only gaze that mattered was Sirius's, watching him with a mixture of wonder and desperate hope. "State your name for the record," Madam Bones said gently. "Harry James Potter," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly despite his nervousness. "And how has Peter Pettigrew's betrayal affected your life, Mr. Potter?" It was the question Harry had been preparing for, but actually answering it proved more difficult than he'd expected. How could he explain 8 years of abuse and neglect? How could he make them understand the cost of growing up without love, without family, without any knowledge of his true heritage? "Peter Pettigrew didn't just betray my parents," Harry said finally. "He stole my entire childhood. Because of his cowardice, I grew up thinking I was worthless, thinking my parents had died because they were careless and reckless. I lived with people who hated me, who told me I was a burden and a freak, who made me believe I deserved to be treated badly." His voice grew stronger as he continued, fueled by years of suppressed anger and pain. "But more than that, he stole my family. My parents should have watched me take my first steps, heard my first words, taught me about magic and love and what it means to belong somewhere. Sirius should have been my godfather, should have told me stories about my parents and helped me understand who I am and where I come from." Harry looked directly at Peter, who was still staring at the floor in shame. "You didn't just kill my parents," he said quietly. "You killed my entire life, my entire identity. And then you let an innocent man suffer for 12 years rather than face the consequences of what you'd done." The courtroom was completely silent when Harry finished speaking. Several members of the Wizengamot were wiping their eyes, and even Minister Fudge looked moved by the testimony. "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Madam Bones said gently. "You may return to your seat." The verdict was unanimous and swift. Peter Pettigrew was sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban for his crimes. Sirius Black was declared innocent of all charges and awarded substantial compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. But for Harry, the most important moment came after the formal proceedings ended, when Sirius was finally free of his chains and able to approach the witness section where Harry waited. "Hello, Harry," Sirius said softly, and his voice was rougher than Harry had expected, damaged by years of disuse and despair. "I'm your godfather. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you." "It wasn't your fault," Harry replied, amazed at how natural it felt to finally meet this man who had been such an important figure in his imagination. "You were exactly where you were supposed to be, fighting for the truth." Sirius smiled, and despite the ravages of his imprisonment, Harry could see echoes of the young man his parents had loved. "Your father would be so proud of you," Sirius said, reaching out tentatively to touch Harry's shoulder. "The way you spoke today, the courage you showed, the person you've become despite everything that was taken from you. James and Lily would be proud beyond words." "Will you tell me about them?" Harry asked. "Real stories, not just the sanitized versions everyone else shares?" "Every story I can remember," Sirius promised. "And Harry, if you want, if you're ready, I'd like to be your family again. I know I can't replace the years we lost, but I'd like to try to give you the life your parents wanted you to have." Harry looked over at Remus, who was watching their reunion with obvious joy mixed with carefully controlled anxiety. The question of how their unconventional family would work still needed to be answered, but Harry found he wasn't worried about the details. "I'd like that," he said simply. "But Remus is family too. He saved me, taught me, gave me everything I never had. Whatever we build together, he's part of it too." Sirius followed Harry's gaze and saw Remus standing nearby, waiting patiently for their reunion to conclude. The two old friends looked at each other across 12 years of separation and loss, and Harry watched as understanding passed between them. "Moony," Sirius said softly, using the old nickname with obvious affection. "Thank you for taking care of him. Thank you for giving him what I couldn't." "He's an extraordinary boy, Padfoot," Remus replied, and Harry could hear the emotion in his voice. "James and Lily would be amazed by who he's become." "Then we'll all take care of him together," Sirius said firmly, "the way it should have been from the beginning." As they left the ministry together, the three of them walking side by side for the first time, Harry felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings they'd just witnessed. This was what family felt like, not just shared blood or legal obligations, but chosen love and mutual commitment to each other's well-being. The wizarding world would have many demands to make of Harry Potter in the days and years to come. There would be expectations and pressures, dangers and challenges that none of them could fully anticipate. But for the first time in his life, Harry would face those challenges with family by his side. Real family, chosen family, the kind of unconditional love and support his parents had always intended him to have. Tomorrow, he would attend Hogwarts as Harry Potter rather than Henry Lupus. Tomorrow, his real education in the complexities of magical society would begin. But today, walking through the streets of magical London with his godfather and the man who had raised him, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, home. The Hogwarts Express pulled away from Platform 9 and 3/4, with a great whoosh of steam and magic, carrying Harry Potter back into the wizarding world he'd left behind as a frightened 8-year-old. But the boy who settled into a compartment near the back of the train bore little resemblance to that terrified child. At 11, Harry had already experienced more of life's complexities than most adults, and his green eyes held depths of understanding that spoke of hard-won wisdom and carefully guarded secrets. "Mind if I join you?" asked a voice from the compartment doorway, and Harry looked up to see a girl with bushy brown hair and earnest brown eyes, her arms full of textbooks that she was clearly determined to master before the train reached Scotland. "Of course," Harry said, gesturing to the empty seats across from him. "I'm Harry. Harry Potter." The girl's eyes widened with recognition, but to Harry's surprise and relief, she didn't immediately begin pestering him with questions about his fame or his scar. Instead, she settled her books carefully on the seat beside her and extended her hand formally. "Hermione Granger," she said. "I've read about you, of course. Every book about modern magical history mentions your defeat of you-know-who when you were a baby. But I imagine you get quite tired of people focusing on that instead of who you actually are." Harry felt a surge of gratitude for her perceptiveness. "You have no idea," he said with genuine warmth. "What are you reading?" "Everything I can get my hands on," Hermione replied, her face lighting up with enthusiasm. "I only learned I was a witch 2 months ago, so I'm trying to catch up on 11 years of not knowing anything about the magical world. Did you know that Hogwarts was founded over 1,000 years ago by 4 of the most powerful witches and wizards of their age? And that the Sorting Hat was originally Godric Gryffindor's hat, enchanted to continue the founder's work of dividing students into houses based on their fundamental character traits?" "I did know that, actually," Harry said, smiling at her obvious passion for learning. It reminded him of his own hunger for magical knowledge during those first weeks with Remus, when every new piece of information had felt like a precious gift. "Are you worried about which house you'll be sorted into?" "Terrified," Hermione admitted. "I keep reading about the house characteristics, trying to figure out where I belong, but I'm not sure I really fit any of them perfectly. I'm certainly brave enough for Gryffindor when it comes to standing up for what's right, but I'm also ambitious like a Slytherin when it comes to my academic goals, and I love learning for its own sake like a Ravenclaw would." "What about Hufflepuff?" "Oh, I'd be honored to be in Hufflepuff," Hermione said quickly. Loyalty and hard work and treating people fairly regardless of their background, those are all wonderful qualities. It's just that everyone seems to think Hufflepuff is the house for people who don't excel at anything else, and I suppose I have too much pride to want to be seen that way." Harry nodded, understanding her concerns. His own anxiety about the sorting was complicated by the knowledge that he would need to be careful about how much of his true abilities he revealed. Professor Lupin, as Remus would be known at Hogwarts, had spent weeks coaching him on how to appear talented, but not suspiciously advanced, for someone raised by Muggles. "I wouldn't worry too much about it," Harry said gently. "From everything I've heard, the Sorting Hat doesn't just look at what you are, but what you want to become. Your intentions matter as much as your natural inclinations." "That's a very mature way of looking at it," Hermione said, studying him with curious eyes. "You don't seem much like what I expected, based on the stories about you. What did you expect? Someone more, I don't know, arrogant, demanding? The boy who lived has been famous since he was a baby. I thought you might be used to having people cater to your every whim or treat you like you're somehow special just because of something that happened to you when you were too young to remember it." Harry thought about the cupboard under the stairs, about Vernon's fists and Petunia's cruel words, and 8 years of being told he was worthless and unwanted. The idea that his fame might have led to a pampered childhood was almost laughably wrong. "I think you'll find that fame is a much more complicated thing than most people realize," he said carefully. "Sometimes being famous means people expect things from you that have nothing to do with who you actually are." Before Hermione could respond, their compartment door slid open again to admit a tall, thin boy with flaming red hair and clothes that had clearly been handed down through several generations of siblings. "Excuse me," the boy said nervously, "but everywhere else is full. Mind if I sit here?" "Not at all," Harry said immediately, recognizing Ron Weasley from their encounter in Diagon Alley. The irony of sharing a train compartment with the boy whose family had unknowingly harbored Peter Pettigrew was not lost on him, but Harry was determined not to hold the Weasleys responsible for what they couldn't have known. "I'm Ron Weasley," the boy said, settling into the remaining seat with obvious relief. "And you're Harry Potter, aren't you? I mean, I can see the scar and all." "I am," Harry confirmed, unconsciously touching the lightning bolt mark on his forehead. The scar had faded significantly since he'd started living with Remus, becoming little more than a thin white line, but it was still visible to those who looked closely. "Wicked," Ron said with genuine enthusiasm. "I mean, not wicked that you-know-who tried to kill you when you were a baby, but wicked that you defeated him. My dad works at the Ministry, and he says your victory was the most important thing to happen to the magical world in centuries." "Your father works at the Ministry?" Harry asked, genuinely interested. He knew from Remus's research that Arthur Weasley was a good man, dedicated to his family and his work, despite the financial struggles that came with having 7 children and a government salary. "Yeah, in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office," Ron said proudly. "He's fascinated by Muggle technology, always bringing home strange things to study. Mum gets mad at him for cluttering up the house, but I think it's brilliant. He can tell you exactly how a telephone works, or why Muggles need electricity to power their lights." Harry smiled, thinking about how Arthur Weasley's genuine curiosity about the Muggle world contrasted sharply with the Dursleys' fearful hatred of anything magical. It was yet another reminder of how different his life might have been if he'd grown up surrounded by people who valued learning and accepted differences rather than punishing them. The conversation flowed easily as the train wound its way through the British countryside, and Harry found himself genuinely enjoying the company of his compartment mates. Hermione's enthusiasm for magical theory reminded him of his own early days with Remus, while Ron's easygoing nature and obvious loyalty made him the kind of friend Harry had never had the chance to make during his isolated childhood. "So what's it like?" Ron asked eventually, his curiosity finally overcoming his politeness. "Living with Muggles, I mean. My dad's always wondered about their daily routines and family structures. Harry had prepared for this question, but actually answering it proved more difficult than he'd expected. How could he explain the Dursleys without revealing too much about why he'd left them? How could he describe a childhood of neglect and abuse without making his new friends pity him or ask uncomfortable questions about his current living situation? "It's different," he said finally. "Muggles don't have magic to solve their problems, so they've developed lots of clever technologies to make their lives easier. But in some ways, their society is much more rigid than ours. They're often afraid of things they don't understand, and they can be quite harsh toward people who don't fit their expectations." "That sounds awful," Hermione said sympathetically. "I've been lucky that my parents are so supportive of my magical abilities, but I've heard stories about Muggle-born children whose families rejected them when they learned about magic." "Yes, well," Harry said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "not everyone is as fortunate as you've been." Ron seemed to pick up on the discomfort in Harry's tone, because he smoothly changed the subject to Quidditch, launching into an enthusiastic description of the Chudley Cannons and their prospects for the upcoming season. Harry was grateful for the distraction, and he found himself genuinely interested in learning about the magical sport his father had loved. "Dad was a chaser for Gryffindor when he was at school," Harry mentioned, when Ron paused for breath. "I've heard he was quite good." "Your dad played Quidditch?" Ron's eyes lit up with excitement. "That's brilliant. What position did he play? Did he ever make it onto a professional team?" "Just chaser for the house team," Harry said, drawing on the stories Remus had shared. He was apparently very good at reading the other team's strategies and finding ways to counter them. More of a tactical player than a raw talent, if you know what I mean. "That's still amazing," Ron said admiringly. "I've been trying to make the house team since I started flying, but I'm not nearly good enough yet." "Maybe you inherited his skills?" Harry shifted uncomfortably, aware that his flying abilities were actually quite advanced, thanks to months of practice with Remus in the Scottish Highlands. But admitting that would raise questions about where and how he'd learned, questions he couldn't answer without revealing far too much about his real circumstances. "I've never actually been on a broomstick," he lied smoothly. "The Muggles I lived with wouldn't allow anything magical in their house." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the lunch trolley, and Harry was grateful for another distraction from the increasingly complex web of half-truths he was being forced to maintain. As they shared chocolate frogs and Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, Harry found himself studying his new friends with the analytical eye Remus had taught him to use when assessing people and situations. Hermione was clearly brilliant, with a quick mind and an impressive breadth of knowledge despite her recent introduction to the magical world. Her questions were incisive and her observations astute, but Harry also sensed an underlying anxiety about proving herself worthy of her place in magical society. She reminded him of himself during those early weeks with Remus, desperate to learn everything and terrified of being found wanting. Ron was more straightforward, lacking Hermione's intellectual intensity, but possessing an emotional intelligence that allowed him to navigate social situations with ease. His loyalty to his family was obvious, and his genuine enthusiasm for the magical world made him an engaging companion. Harry suspected that Ron would be the kind of friend who would stand by you no matter what challenges arose. Both of them seemed genuinely kind, the sort of people who would make excellent friends if Harry could figure out how to maintain his friendships while keeping his secrets. It was a delicate balance, and one that would require careful management throughout his time at Hogwarts. As the afternoon wore on, the train began to slow, and other students started changing into their school robes. Harry excused himself to use the lavatory, but his real purpose was to find Remus and get a final briefing before they arrived at the castle. He found Professor Lupin in the teacher's compartment, looking remarkably professional in his new teaching robes, despite the underlying weariness that 12 years of lycanthropy had etched into his features. The other professors were engaged in their own conversations, giving Harry and Remus a moment of relative privacy. "How are you managing?" Remus asked quietly, his concern evident despite the formal distance he was maintaining for the benefit of any observers. Better than expected, Harry replied honestly. I've made some friends, I think. Nice people who seem genuinely interested in getting to know me rather than just the famous Scar. That's wonderful, Harry. Building real friendships will be important for your emotional development and your cover story. Just remember what we discussed about revealing too much about your abilities too quickly. I remember, though it's harder than I expected, pretending to know less than I do. I understand, but it's necessary. Harry, once we reach Hogwarts, our relationship will have to change. I'll still be there for you if you need me, but I can't show you obvious favoritism or give you special treatment. You'll need to rely on your own judgment more than you're used to. Harry nodded, though the prospect of losing Remus's constant guidance and support was daunting. For almost a year, his guardian had been his primary source of stability and wisdom. Learning to navigate Hogwarts without that direct support would be another challenge to master. What about Sirius? Have you heard from him? He's settling into Grimmauld Place, trying to make the family home habitable after years of neglect. The transition to freedom is difficult for him, but he's determined to create a proper home for you to visit during holidays and summers. And Dumbledore? Dumbledore is being patient for now, but he'll want to meet with you soon after the sorting. He has questions about your missing years, your guardianship arrangements, and your magical education. We've prepared answers, but you'll need to be very careful about what you reveal. Harry nodded again, feeling the familiar weight of secrets and responsibilities settling on his shoulders. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to be a normal 11-year-old, worried only about making friends and passing his classes rather than managing complex deceptions and navigating adult politics. But then he remembered the alternative. Life with the Dursleys, ignorance of his magical heritage, isolation and abuse instead of love and learning. Whatever challenges lay ahead at Hogwarts, they were infinitely preferable to the life he'd escaped. Professor Lupin, one of the other teachers called. We're approaching the station. Time to prepare the students for disembarkation. Of course, Professor McGonagall, Remus replied formally, then gave Harry a subtle nod that conveyed both encouragement and affection. I'll see you at the sorting, Mr. Potter. Harry made his way back to his compartment, where Hermione and Ron were already struggling into their school robes and gathering their belongings. Outside the windows, he could see the towers of Hogwarts rising against the darkening sky, their windows glowing with warm light that promised safety and belonging. First sight of the castle, Ron said reverently. Never gets old according to my brothers. They say it's even more impressive from inside. It's enormous, Hermione breathed, pressing her face to the window. The architecture is incredible. Medieval construction techniques combined with magical enhancements to create something that's both historically authentic and functionally superior to anything Muggles could build. Harry smiled at her typically analytical response, but his own reaction to Hogwarts was more emotional than academic. This was his parents' school, the place where they'd fallen in love and formed friendships, and learned the magic that would eventually cost them their lives in defense of their son. Walking through its halls would be like following in their footsteps, connecting with a part of his heritage that had been denied to him for so long. The train pulled into Hogsmeade Station with a great hiss of steam, and students began pouring onto the platform in excited chattering groups. Harry followed Ron and Hermione into the crowd, his eyes scanning automatically for potential threats or escape routes despite the apparent safety of their surroundings. "Fur's years. Fur's years over here," boomed a voice that seemed to come from somewhere near the ceiling, and Harry looked up to see an enormous man with wild hair and kind eyes beckoning to the newest students. This had to be Hagrid, the keeper of keys and grounds, whom Remus had described as one of the most genuinely good people in the magical world. "No more'n 4 to a boat," Hagrid called, as he led them down to the lake shore, where a fleet of small boats waited in the moonlight. "Everyone in? Right then. Forward." The boats moved across the black water by themselves, carrying their passengers around a bend in the shoreline that revealed Hogwarts in all its nighttime glory. The castle rose from the water like something from a dream, its many towers and turrets illuminated against the star-filled sky, its reflection dancing on the lake's surface in patterns that seemed almost alive. "Welcome to Hogwarts," Harry whispered to himself, and felt something deep in his chest settle into place, as if he'd finally arrived where he was meant to be. The boats deposited them at the castle's water entrance, and Professor McGonagall was waiting to lead them through corridors that were even more impressive than Harry had imagined. Moving staircases, talking portraits, floating candles, and everywhere the sense of ancient magic woven so deeply into the stone that it had become part of the castle's very essence. "Before you take your seats in the Great Hall," Professor McGonagall announced as they gathered in an antechamber, "you will be sorted into your houses. The 4 houses are Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Your house will be like your family during your time at Hogwarts. Your triumphs will earn your house points, while any rule-breaking will lose points." Harry found himself studying his fellow first-years as McGonagall spoke, noting their various states of nervousness and excitement. Some, like Hermione, were practically vibrating with anxiety and anticipation. Others seemed to take the whole process in stride, probably from magical families that had prepared them well for this moment. "The sorting ceremony will begin momentarily," McGonagall concluded. "I suggest you use this time to straighten your robes and compose yourselves." As they waited, Harry's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with Remus about houses and their characteristics. Gryffindor was the obvious choice, the house of his parents and their friends, the house that valued bravery and standing up for what was right. But Harry wondered if the sorting hat would see past that surface compatibility to the more complex aspects of his personality. His year with Remus had revealed depths to his character that he was still discovering. Yes, he was brave when the situation demanded it, but he was also calculating and strategic, willing to use deception and misdirection when they served his goals. He valued knowledge and learning, but he also had ambitions that went beyond simple academic achievement. Most importantly, he had learned the value of loyalty and hard work, of treating people fairly regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. The Hufflepuff qualities that were so often dismissed as somehow lesser than the flashier attributes of the other houses had proven essential to his development as both a wizard and a person. "It's time," Professor McGonagall announced, and the first years followed her into the Great Hall. The hall was even more magnificent than Harry had imagined, with its 4 long house tables filled with students and its head table where the professors sat in their formal robes. Thousands of floating candles provided warm light, while the enchanted ceiling showed the night sky in perfect detail, complete with slowly drifting clouds and twinkling stars. At the head table, Harry could see Professor Lupin sitting with his new colleagues, maintaining the careful professional distance they'd agreed upon. Next to him sat Professor Snape, whose black eyes seemed to find Harry immediately and fix on him with an intensity that was both unsettling and somehow familiar. But it was the wizard at the center of the head table who commanded Harry's primary attention. Albus Dumbledore sat in an ornate chair that was practically a throne, his long silver beard and half-moon spectacles making him look like the archetypal wise wizard from children's stories. But his blue eyes, twinkling though they were, held depths of calculation and authority that reminded Harry why Remus had been so careful to prepare him for this meeting. The sorting hat sat on a simple stool in front of the assembled students, looking exactly like what it was, an ancient, patched wizard's hat that had seen centuries of use. As Harry watched, it opened what might generously be called a mouth and began to sing. The song was traditional, describing the 4 houses and their founders' values, but Harry found himself listening more to the underlying message about choice and belonging than to the specific details about courage and ambition. When the hat finished, Professor McGonagall began calling names from her long scroll, and the ceremony began in earnest. Harry watched as his fellow first-years were sorted, noting patterns in the hat's decisions and trying to predict where his own name would place him. Hermione was called relatively early. Granger, Hermione, and the hat took several long moments to consider before announcing Gryffindor to enthusiastic cheers from the red and gold table. More names were called, more students were sorted, and finally, Harry heard the words he'd been waiting for. "Potter! Harry!" The great hall fell completely silent as Harry stepped forward to take his place on the stool. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, some curious, some awed, some calculating. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and everything else faded away as an ancient voice spoke directly into his mind. "Well, well," the hat said thoughtfully. "Harry Potter. I've been wondering when you'd come to me, young man, though I must say, you're not at all what I expected." What did you expect? Harry thought back. Someone simpler, perhaps. Someone whose character had been shaped by fame and adulation rather than hardship and careful education. But I can see that your path has been quite different from what the wizarding world assumes. Harry remained silent, uncertain how much the hat could actually see, and unwilling to reveal more than necessary. "Oh, I can see quite a lot," the hat continued, apparently reading his thoughts. "A brilliant mind, certainly, worthy of Ravenclaw. Ambition and cunning that would serve you well in Slytherin. Loyalty and fairness that mark you as potential Hufflepuff material. And yes, courage and moral conviction that are the hallmarks of Gryffindor. So where do I belong? That, my dear boy, is the question. You could excel in any of the 4 houses, which makes the choice both easier and more difficult. Tell me, Harry Potter, what do you value most? What kind of person do you want to become?" Harry thought about the question seriously. What did he value most? The knowledge and skills that had freed him from ignorance and helplessness? The cunning and strategic thinking that had helped him navigate complex situations? The loyalty and love that had given him family when he'd thought he was completely alone? "I want to become someone my parents would be proud of," he said finally. "Someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Someone who protects the people they care about and fights against injustice." "Ah," the hat said with satisfaction. "Yes, I think I see where you belong. Though I suspect your time at Hogwarts will reveal depths to your character that even you haven't discovered yet." The hat paused for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, then spoke the word that would define Harry's Hogwarts experience: Gryffindor. The red and gold table erupted in cheers as Harry made his way to his new house, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges and opportunities that awaited him. He took a seat next to Hermione, who beamed at him with obvious delight, and watched as the sorting continued. When Ron's name was called, the hat barely touched his head before shouting, "Gryffindor!" and sending the redhead to join his new housemates at their table. The 3 friends grinned at each other, pleased to have ended up together, despite the randomness of the sorting process. As the feast began and food appeared magically on the golden plates, Harry found himself relaxing for the first time since boarding the Hogwarts Express. The conversations flowing around him were typical of any group of children getting to know each other. Questions about family backgrounds, speculation about classes and teachers, excited chatter about the magical world and all its wonders. But even as he participated in these normal, friendly discussions, Harry remained aware of the more complex currents flowing beneath the surface. Professor Dumbledore's eyes found him frequently during the meal, and each glance seemed to carry a weight of expectation and curiosity that made Harry grateful for all the preparation Remus had provided. Professor Snape, too, seemed unusually interested in the new Gryffindor students, his dark gaze lingering on Harry in particular with an expression that was difficult to interpret. There was recognition there, certainly, but also something that might have been pain or regret or perhaps simple dislike. "That's Professor Snape," whispered Dean Thomas, one of Harry's new dorm mates. "He teaches potions and heads Slytherin House. My older brother says he's brilliant, but absolutely terrifying, and that he particularly hates Gryffindor students." "Why would he hate Gryffindors?" Hermione asked with her typical directness. House rivalry mostly, replied Seamus Finnegan. Plus he was in Slytherin when he was a student, and apparently there was bad blood between his year and some of the Gryffindors from that time. Harry filed this information away for later consideration, though he suspected the situation with Professor Snape was more complicated than simple house rivalry. The intensity of the man's attention suggested personal rather than institutional animosity, though Harry couldn't imagine what he might have done to earn such focused dislike. The feast concluded with Dumbledore's traditional warnings about the Forbidden Forest and the third-floor corridor, delivered with the kind of theatrical seriousness that made them sound more like invitations than prohibitions. Then the students were dismissed to their dormitories, led by the house prefects through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking directly at them. "The staircases like to change," explained Percy Weasley, Ron's prefect brother, as he guided the first years through the castle's maze-like interior. "You'll get used to it eventually, though I recommend leaving a few extra minutes for travel time until you learn the most reliable routes." Gryffindor Tower was everything Harry had hoped it would be, warm and welcoming, with comfortable furniture arranged around a crackling fireplace and windows that looked out over the grounds and the Forbidden Forest beyond. The common room buzzed with conversation and laughter, students from all years mixing together in the kind of informal family atmosphere that Harry had only recently learned to value. "Boys' dormitories are up those stairs," Percy announced, pointing to a spiral staircase. "Girls' dormitories are up the other staircase. Your belongings have already been brought up, and you'll find your beds assigned by name." Harry climbed to the first-year boys' dormitory with Ron, Dean, Seamus, and Neville Longbottom, a round-faced boy who seemed nervous about everything, but had shown flashes of quiet determination during the evening's conversations. Their dormitory was cozy and private, with 5 four-poster beds hung with deep red curtains and windows that provided stunning views of the lake and mountains. "This is brilliant," Ron said happily, bouncing on his bed to test the mattress. "Much better than sharing with my brothers at home." Harry unpacked his trunk carefully, making sure to keep his more advanced magical texts hidden beneath his standard school books. The last thing he needed was for his dormmates to start asking questions about why an 11-year-old raised by Muggles owned books on advanced transfiguration theory and defensive magic. "So what do you think of it so far?" Dean asked as they prepared for bed. "Hogwarts, I mean. Different from what you expected?" "It's incredible," Harry said honestly. "The magic, the history, the sense of belonging somewhere that accepts you for who you are. I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else." "Even with all the attention you're going to get?" Seamus asked curiously. "I mean, you're famous, mate. Everyone's going to want to know about your life, your experiences, how you defeated you-know-who when you were just a baby." "I'll manage," Harry said with quiet confidence. "Fame is just what other people think about you. It doesn't define who you actually are or what you choose to do with your life." "That's very wise," Neville said softly. "My grandmother always says that character is what you do when no one is watching, not what people say about you when everyone is." Harry smiled at the shy boy, sensing depths beneath Neville's nervous exterior that reminded him of his own hidden qualities. "Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman." "She is. She raised me after my parents were... after what happened to them during the war. She's the strongest person I know." There was pain in Neville's voice, old grief that spoke of losses Harry understood all too well. Without really thinking about it, Harry reached out to offer comfort in the way Remus had taught him. "Family isn't just the people who are related to you by blood," he said gently. "It's the people who choose to love and support you, who help you become the person you're meant to be. Your grandmother sounds like real family in every way that matters." Neville's grateful smile was worth the small risk of revealing too much about his own philosophy regarding family and belonging. As his dormmates settled into sleep, Harry lay awake thinking about everything that had happened since boarding the Hogwarts Express that morning. He'd made friends, been sorted into his parents' house, begun the process of establishing himself in the magical world without revealing the full extent of his abilities or experiences. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, classes with professors who might see through his careful disguises, interactions with students from all four houses, and inevitably a meeting with Dumbledore that would test every aspect of the cover story he and Remus had constructed. But tonight, lying in a warm bed in a castle full of magic and surrounded by people who had welcomed him without question, Harry Potter felt something he'd never experienced during his years with the Dursleys. He felt like he was home. Outside his window, the lake reflected the starlight in patterns that seemed to pulse with ancient magic, while somewhere in the castle, Professor Lupin was probably grading papers or preparing lessons, maintaining his professional distance while keeping a careful watch over his former ward. And in London, Sirius Black was probably sitting in the restored drawing room of Grimmauld Place, staring at photographs of the friends he'd lost and the godson he'd finally found, planning the kind of future that had once seemed impossible. Harry smiled as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams filled with flying motorcycles and laughing parents and the promise of adventures yet to come. Whatever challenges awaited him at Hogwarts, he would face them with courage, intelligence, and the unshakable knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. The morning edition of the Daily Prophet arrived at Hogwarts like a thunderclap, carried by hundreds of owls that darkened the sky above the Great Hall during breakfast. Harry had been enjoying a quiet conversation with Hermione about the previous day's Transfiguration lesson, when the familiar screech of Rita Skeeter's sensationalist headlines shattered the peaceful atmosphere of his second week at school. "Pettigrew confesses, Sirius Black innocent," screamed the front page, in letters so large they seemed to vibrate with their own magical energy. Below the headline, a photograph of Peter Pettigrew in chains alternated with an image of Sirius Black, looking haggard but determined as he walked free from the Ministry of Magic. The Great Hall erupted into chaos. Students from all four houses began talking at once, their voices rising to a cacophony of shock, disbelief, and excited speculation. Professors abandoned their breakfast to huddle around their own copies of the paper, while house elves scurried about trying to serve food to people who were far too distracted to eat. Harry sat frozen in his seat, watching the pandemonium unfold around him, while his stomach churned with a mixture of triumph and terror. This was the moment they had worked toward for months, the public vindication that would finally clear Sirius's name and expose the truth about his parents' betrayal. But it was also the moment that would irrevocably change Harry's carefully constructed new life at Hogwarts. "Harry," Hermione whispered urgently, her hand gripping his arm. "Harry, this is about your godfather, isn't it? The man who was supposed to have betrayed your parents." Before Harry could respond, Ron appeared at his shoulder, having abandoned the Gryffindor table's copy of the Prophet to peer at the one Hermione was holding with white-knuckled intensity. "Blimey," Ron breathed, his freckled face pale with shock. "Pettigrew, that name sounds familiar. Where have I heard it before?" Harry's heart clenched as he realized that Ron was probably remembering his pet rat, the animal he'd loved and cared for without knowing its true identity. The Weasley family would be devastated when they learned the truth, and there was nothing Harry could do to spare them that pain. "Students!" Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the noise like a blade, magically amplified to reach every corner of the Great Hall. "Students, please return to your seats and continue your breakfast. Classes will proceed as normal this morning." But normal was clearly impossible. Even as students reluctantly returned to their house tables, the buzz of conversation continued unabated. Harry could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him, studying his reaction, trying to read the secrets hidden behind his carefully neutral expression. At the head table, Professor Dumbledore was engaged in quiet but intense conversation with several of his colleagues, their faces grave with the implications of the morning's revelations. Professor Lupin sat among them, maintaining his professional composure despite what Harry knew must be overwhelming joy at finally seeing his friend's innocence proven to the world. "Mr. Potter," came a familiar drawling voice from behind him, and Harry turned to see Draco Malfoy approaching with his usual complement of Slytherin followers. "How interesting that your godfather's dramatic vindication should coincide so precisely with your return to the wizarding world, almost as if someone had been planning this revelation for quite some time." Harry met Malfoy's calculating grey eyes with steady calm, drawing on months of training with Remus in keeping his emotions under control during stressful situations. "I imagine the timing is purely coincidental," he said evenly. "Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how long people try to suppress it." "Does it?" Malfoy's smile was cold and knowing. "How fascinating that you would phrase it that way. One might almost think you had personal experience with suppressed truths and their eventual revelation." "One might think a lot of things," Harry replied, allowing just a hint of steel to enter his voice. "But thinking and knowing are very different things, wouldn't you agree?" The verbal sparring was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Snape, who swept down upon their group like a bat descending from the castle rafters. His black eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that seemed to burn straight through his careful defences. "Mr. Potter," Snape said silkily, his voice carrying clearly despite its low volume, "how convenient that your famous name should once again be associated with such dramatic developments in the magical world. Tell me, do you find it difficult to concentrate on your studies when such momentous events are unfolding around you?" "Not at all, Professor," Harry said politely. "I found that maintaining focus on one's immediate responsibilities is the best way to handle distracting circumstances." "Indeed." Snape's eyes narrowed fractionally. "How remarkably mature of you. One might almost think you had experience dealing with complex and potentially dangerous situations." Harry felt the weight of the professor's suspicion settling around him like a net, but he kept his expression bland and respectful. "I've always believed that maturity comes from taking responsibility for one's actions and choices, Professor, regardless of one's age or circumstances. A philosophical perspective that suggests considerable life experience for someone so young." Snape's pause was deliberately loaded with meaning. "Tell me, Mr. Potter, what do you know about your godfather's innocence? Surely someone as astute as yourself must have formed opinions about such a significant development." It was a trap, elegantly laid and beautifully baited. Snape was probing for any sign that Harry had prior knowledge of Sirius's innocence, any indication that he had been involved in the investigation that led to Peter's capture and confession. A single incautious word could unravel months of careful preparation and expose the true complexity of Harry's situation. "I know what everyone else knows, Professor," Harry said carefully. "What's written in the Daily Prophet this morning, that Peter Pettigrew confessed to betraying my parents to Voldemort and framing Sirius Black for his own crimes. I'm certainly relieved to learn that my godfather is innocent, but I can't claim to have had any special insight into the situation." "How disappointing," Snape murmured, though his expression suggested anything but disappointment. One might have hoped that the famous Harry Potter would have something more interesting to contribute to such a significant revelation. "I'm afraid my fame is rather more limited than people assume, Professor. I'm just a student trying to learn magic and pass my classes." "Indeed. How refreshingly humble." Snape's smile was razor-thin. "Well then, Mr. Potter, I suggest you return your attention to your breakfast, and perhaps you might consider the wisdom of avoiding unnecessary speculation about matters that don't directly concern you." With that pointed warning, the potions master swept away, leaving Harry feeling as though he'd just survived his first real test of the cover story he and Remus had constructed. But even as he congratulated himself on navigating the encounter successfully, Harry was aware that Professor Snape remained unconvinced by his performance. "Blimey, Harry," Ron said quietly as they watched Snape's dramatic exit. "What was that about? Why was he questioning you like you were some kind of suspect?" "Professor Snape has a reputation for being Intense, Hermione said diplomatically. I imagine he's just curious about how the developments affect you personally, given your connection to Sirius Black. Yeah, but it felt like more than curiosity, Ron insisted. Like he thinks Harry knows something he's not saying. Harry forced a laugh that he hoped sounded genuinely amused rather than nervous. What would I know? I've been at Hogwarts for 2 weeks, same as you. Everything I've learned about Sirius Black came from books and old newspaper articles, not from personal experience. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. Harry was discovering that the line between necessary deception and outright dishonesty was much thinner and more uncomfortable than he'd expected. The morning's first class was Defense Against the Dark Arts with Professor Lupin, and Harry approached the subject classroom with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. This would be his first opportunity to see Remus in his professional capacity, to observe how their relationship would function within the formal structure of Hogwarts education. The classroom itself was warm and welcoming, filled with interesting artifacts and defensive equipment that spoke of practical experience rather than purely theoretical knowledge. Professor Lupin stood at the front of the room, looking every bit the competent educator, despite the subtle signs of exhaustion that Harry had learned to recognize over the past year. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Lupin said, as the first-year Gryffindors and Slytherins filed into the classroom. "I trust you've all had an eventful morning, with the Daily Prophet's rather dramatic headlines." A ripple of nervous laughter greeted this observation, along with several curious glances in Harry's direction. However, Professor Lupin continued smoothly. "We are here to learn defense against the dark arts, not to speculate about current events or their personal implications for our classmates. Today we will be beginning our study of basic protective charms, starting with the theory behind magical defense and the importance of intent in defensive spell work." Harry felt a surge of gratitude for Remus's tactful handling of what could have been an extremely awkward situation. By acknowledging the morning's revelations without dwelling on them, he had effectively redirected the class's attention toward their studies, while subtly discouraging further speculation about Harry's connection to the events. The lesson itself was fascinating, even though Harry was forced to pretend ignorance of concepts he had mastered months ago. Professor Lupin's teaching style was engaging and thorough, combining theoretical explanations with practical demonstrations that brought the subject matter to life. "Can anyone tell me why intent is so crucial to defensive magic?" Professor Lupin asked, scanning the classroom for volunteers. Hermione's hand shot up immediately, but so did several others, including Harry's own before he caught himself and lowered it again. "Miss Granger?" "Intent is crucial because defensive spells require absolute commitment to protecting yourself or others," Hermione said confidently. "The strength of your magical protection depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice to maintain it." "Excellent. 5 points to Gryffindor." Professor Lupin's approving smile encompassed the entire class, but Harry caught the brief moment when his eyes lingered meaningfully on his former ward. "Intent, as Miss Granger correctly notes, is the foundation of all defensive magic. But it goes deeper than mere commitment. True defensive magic requires you to understand exactly what you are protecting and why that protection matters." As the lesson continued, Harry found himself torn between admiration for Remus's teaching skills and frustration at having to conceal his own advanced knowledge. Several times he had to bite his tongue to keep from offering insights that would have revealed the depth of his training, instead sitting quietly while his classmates struggled with concepts he could have explained in detail. "Now then," Professor Lupin said, as the class period neared its end, "for homework, I want each of you to write 12 inches on the theoretical foundations of the shield charm. Focus particularly on the relationship between emotional commitment and spell effectiveness. Due next class." As students began packing their bags, Professor Lupin called out casually, "Mr. Potter, might I have a word?" "Nothing serious, just a quick question about your placement in this class." Harry's pulse quickened as he approached the teacher's desk, aware that several of his classmates were lingering in the corridor outside, probably hoping to overhear whatever conversation was about to take place. "Close the door, would you?" Professor Lupin said quietly, once they were alone. The moment the door clicked shut, Remus's professional demeanor shifted slightly, allowing warmth and concern to show in his expression. "How are you managing?" he asked softly. "This morning must have been quite overwhelming." "Better than I expected," Harry said honestly, though Professor Snape was asking some pointed questions about what I might know regarding Sirius's case. "I saw. You handled it well, but Severus is perceptive. He remembers your father, and he's noticed that you're more mature and self-possessed than most children your age. We'll need to be even more careful going forward. What about the rest of the school? How are people reacting?" "Mixed responses, as you might expect. Most students are simply excited by the drama of it all, but some of the older ones who remember the original case are asking more sophisticated questions. The Slytherins in particular seem suspicious of the timing." Harry nodded, having anticipated this development. "And Dumbledore? Wants to see you immediately after classes today. He's been remarkably patient so far, but this morning's revelations have apparently convinced him that he can no longer afford to wait for you to settle in before having that conversation." The prospect of facing the headmaster's questions sent a chill down Harry's spine, but he forced himself to remain calm. They had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed the story, and practiced the responses that would satisfy Dumbledore's curiosity without revealing too much about the true complexity of Harry's situation. "Are you ready?" Remus asked gently. "As ready as I can be," Harry replied, though his voice carried less confidence than he would have preferred. "Remember what we discussed. You're 11 years old, you've been living with Muggles since you left the Dursleys, and your knowledge of the magical world comes primarily from books and the occasional accidental magic incident. Let Dumbledore draw his own conclusions rather than volunteering information he hasn't specifically requested. I understand." "Good." Remus glanced toward the door, where they could hear students gathering for the next class. "Now, I believe you have Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall. Try to focus on your studies rather than worrying about this afternoon. Everything will work out as it should." Harry nodded and made his way to the door, but paused before opening it. "Remus, thank you. For everything. Whatever happens with Dumbledore, I want you to know how grateful I am for all you've done." "We're family, Harry," Remus said simply. "That doesn't change, regardless of what complications arise." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes and conversations, with Harry finding it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his studies as news of Sirius's vindication spread throughout the school. Every lesson was punctuated by whispered speculation about the case, with students and professors alike stealing glances at Harry as if expecting him to provide insider information about the dramatic developments. Lunch in the Great Hall was particularly challenging, as owls continued to arrive throughout the meal, carrying additional newspapers, letters, and packages for students whose families wanted to share their reactions to the morning's revelations. Harry's own mail included several letters addressed to him personally, though he didn't recognize any of the return addresses. "Fan mail?" Ron asked, curiously, as Harry stared at the small pile of correspondence. "I hope not," Harry said, with genuine dread. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of renewed public attention, a living symbol of the injustices that had been corrected and the truths that had been revealed. Hermione picked up one of the letters and examined the address with her typical analytical precision. "This one is from the offices of Witch Weekly," she reported, "and this one appears to be from someone at the Ministry of Magic. Probably reporters wanting interviews and officials wanting to debrief me about my experiences," Harry said, pushing the letters aside without opening them. "I'm not ready to deal with any of that yet." "You don't have to," Hermione said firmly. "You're 11 years old and you're entitled to privacy, regardless of how famous you are or how dramatic recent events have been." "Tell that to the wizarding world," Harry said ruefully. I get the impression that privacy isn't a concept most magical people understand when it comes to celebrities. The afternoon's classes seemed to drag on forever, with Harry finding it impossible to focus on anything other than the approaching meeting with Dumbledore. By the time his final lesson ended, his nerves were stretched taut with anticipation and anxiety. "Good luck," Hermione whispered, as they parted ways outside the Charms classroom. "Remember, you don't owe anyone explanations about your private life." "Thanks," Harry replied, though he suspected that Albus Dumbledore would have rather different ideas about what Harry owed, and to whom. The headmaster's office was located behind a stone gargoyle that moved aside when Harry spoke the password Professor McGonagall had provided. The spiral staircase beyond carried him upward to an oak door that opened before he could knock. "Ah, Harry," came Dumbledore's familiar voice from within the circular office. "Please come in and make yourself comfortable." The office itself was exactly what Harry had expected, filled with delicate silver instruments that clicked and whirred mysteriously, lined with portraits of former headmasters who watched visitors with painted eyes, and dominated by a magnificent phoenix perched on a golden stand near the window. The air hummed with old magic and ancient wisdom, creating an atmosphere of power that was both comforting and slightly intimidating. "Tea?" Dumbledore offered, gesturing to a service that had appeared on the small table between two comfortable armchairs. "Or perhaps something sweeter? I find that lemon drops have a remarkable ability to facilitate difficult conversations." "Tea would be fine, thank you," Harry said politely, taking the offered seat and accepting a delicate china cup filled with perfectly brewed Earl Grey. "Excellent." Dumbledore settled into the opposite chair, his blue eyes twinkling with what appeared to be genuine warmth despite the serious nature of their meeting. "Now then, Harry, I imagine you know why I wished to speak with you." "I assume it has something to do with this morning's revelations about Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew," Harry said carefully. "Indeed, though I confess my interest extends somewhat beyond the immediate news reports." Dumbledore paused to sip his tea, studying Harry with the kind of penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through surface appearances to the truths hidden beneath. "You see, Harry, I have been most curious about your whereabouts during the past 3 years, ever since you disappeared from your relative's home in Little Whinging." Harry's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral and attentive. "I'm not sure I understand, Professor. I haven't disappeared from anywhere. I've been living quietly, attending Muggle school, learning about the magical world through books and preparation for coming to Hogwarts." "Have you indeed?" Dumbledore's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the surface now. "How interesting. You see, Harry, I have made several attempts over the years to locate you, to ensure your continued safety and well-being. Yet my efforts were consistently unsuccessful, as if you had simply vanished from the world entirely." "Perhaps you were looking in the wrong places," Harry suggested. "The Muggle world is quite large, and it's easy for someone to live quietly if they choose to do so." "Perhaps?" Dumbledore's pause was loaded with meaning. "Tell me, Harry, what do you remember about the night you left your aunt and uncle's house? The circumstances that led to your departure must have been quite significant to prompt such drastic action from someone so young." This was the crucial question, the one Harry and Remus had anticipated and prepared for most carefully. The story had to be believable but not too detailed, sympathetic but not inflammatory, complete enough to satisfy curiosity, but vague enough to discourage follow-up questions. "There was a disagreement," Harry said slowly, as if the memories were painful and difficult to access. "A rather serious one about my unusual abilities. My aunt and uncle were frightened of magic, you understand, and they became increasingly hostile toward anything that reminded them of the magical world." "I see. And so you decided to leave?" "I became lost during the argument," Harry corrected gently. "I was upset and confused, and I wandered away from the house. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, I couldn't find my way back. I was found by someone who took me in and cared for me. Someone who took you in, Dumbledore repeated thoughtfully. Might I ask who this good Samaritan was? A kind man who had lost his own family and was living quietly in the Muggle world, Harry said, sticking to the prepared story. He helped me understand my magical heritage and prepared me for attending Hogwarts. I owe him a great deal. Indeed. And this gentleman's name? I'd rather not say, if you don't mind. He values his privacy very much, and I don't think he would appreciate being drawn into conversations about my famous connections or dramatic family history. Dumbledore nodded slowly, though Harry could see sharp intelligence working behind those twinkling blue eyes. Of course, I understand the desire for privacy. Tell me, Harry, during your time away from the wizarding world, did you have any contact with Sirius Black? Any knowledge of his situation, or the circumstances surrounding his imprisonment? None at all, Harry said firmly. Everything I knew about Sirius came from books and old newspaper articles. I had no idea he was innocent until this morning's Daily Prophet, same as everyone else. How remarkably coincidental, then, that his vindication should occur so soon after your return to magical society. The observation hung in the air between them, like an accusation, though Dumbledore's tone remained conversational and unthreatening. I suppose truth has its own timeline, Harry said evenly. Justice delayed isn't necessarily justice denied, especially when there are people willing to work toward uncovering the facts. Wise words from someone so young. Tell me, Harry, what are your plans now that your godfather has been cleared of all charges? I imagine Sirius will want to resume his role in your life. I hope so, Harry said with genuine warmth. I've never had a real family before, and the idea of finally knowing someone who loved my parents is wonderful beyond description. And your guardian, the gentleman who took you in after your departure from the Dursleys, how does he feel about potentially sharing his role with Sirius? Harry smiled, remembering Remus's words about family being defined by choice rather than obligation. I think he understands that love isn't diminished by being shared. Having more people who care about you is a blessing, not a burden. A mature perspective indeed. Dumbledore set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. Harry, I want you to know that I deeply regret the circumstances that led to your departure from your relative's care. The protection I arranged was meant to keep you safe, but clearly it failed to provide the emotional security and nurturing that every child deserves. I understand that you did what you thought was best, Harry said diplomatically. Sometimes good intentions aren't enough, but that doesn't make the intentions themselves wrong. You are remarkably forgiving for someone who has endured such difficulties. I hope you know that Hogwarts will always be a safe haven for you, regardless of what complications may arise in your life outside these walls. Thank you, Professor. That means a great deal to me. Excellent. Dumbledore's smile returned to its earlier warmth. Now then, unless you have questions for me, I believe you should return to your dormitory. I imagine your housemates are eager to discuss the day's revelations, and you could probably use some time to process everything that has happened. Harry stood and moved toward the door, but paused when Dumbledore spoke again. Oh, and Harry, please give my regards to Professor Lupin. I find myself quite impressed with his teaching methods and his obvious dedication to his students' welfare. The words were casual, almost an afterthought, but Harry felt their weight like a physical blow. Dumbledore knew. Somehow, despite all their careful preparation and meticulous cover story construction, the headmaster had identified Remus as Harry's mysterious guardian. I'll be sure to pass along your compliments, Harry said calmly, though his mind was racing with the implications of this development. Splendid. Good evening, Harry. Sleep well. The spiral staircase carried Harry downward in silence, his thoughts churning with everything that had been said and left unsaid during his conversation with the headmaster. Dumbledore's gentle probing had been more sophisticated than he'd expected, and while Harry believed he had handled the immediate questions successfully, it was clear that the headmaster remained suspicious of the official version of events. More troubling still was the apparent recognition of Remus's role in Harry's life. If Dumbledore knew that Professor Lupin was the guardian who had taken Harry in after his departure from the Dursleys, then their carefully constructed deception was already beginning to unravel. The common room was buzzing with activity when Harry finally reached Gryffindor Tower, filled with students eagerly discussing the day's revelations and their implications for the magical world. Harry slipped through the crowd as inconspicuously as possible, hoping to reach the dormitory stairs before anyone could corner him with questions. "Harry!" Hermione's voice called out, just as he thought he'd made it to safety. "We've been waiting for you. How did it go with Professor Dumbledore?" Ron looked up from the chess game he'd been playing with Dean, his expression full of curiosity and concern. "Everything all right, mate? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," Harry said, settling into an empty chair near the fireplace. "It's been a long day, and talking about family history isn't exactly my favorite activity." "I can imagine," Hermione said sympathetically. "Did Professor Dumbledore have any insights about your godfather's case? I mean, he must have known Sirius Black personally, given their involvement in the war against you-know-who." "He seemed as surprised as anyone by the revelations," Harry said carefully, though he did express regret about the way things worked out with my placement after my parents died. "At least now you'll have a real family," Ron said, with the easy optimism of someone who had never lacked for loving relatives. "Sirius Black will probably want to make up for lost time, take you on adventures, teach you all sorts of advanced magic." The idea was appealing, but Harry found himself thinking more about the complexities that lay ahead than the simple pleasures Ron was describing. Sirius would indeed want to resume his role as godfather, but he would also need time to readjust to freedom after 12 years of imprisonment. Remus would want to maintain his connection to Harry while respecting Sirius's legal rights and emotional needs. And somewhere in the background, Dumbledore would be watching and evaluating, trying to determine how much control he should attempt to exert over Harry's future. "I'm sure it will all work out," Harry said, though privately he wondered if anything in his life would ever be as simple as Ron seemed to believe. "Of course it will," Hermione said firmly. "You've got friends here at Hogwarts, you've got Professor Lupin looking out for you, and now you'll have your godfather back in your life. Things are definitely looking up." Harry smiled at his friend's confidence, drawing comfort from their unwavering support, even as he worried about the secrets he was keeping from them. They cared about him, genuinely and unconditionally, and that caring made the deceptions he was forced to maintain feel even more uncomfortable than they already were. "Thanks," he said simply, "for everything. Having friends who accept you for who you are is, well, it's something I never experienced before coming to Hogwarts." "That's what friends do," Ron said with typical directness. "We stick together, no matter what." "Always," Hermione agreed. "Whatever challenges come up, whatever complications arise from your family situation or your fame or anything else, you don't have to face them alone." As his friends returned to their various activities and the common room gradually settled into its evening routine, Harry found himself staring into the fire and thinking about the future that stretched ahead of him. The public revelation of Sirius's innocence had changed everything, just as he and Remus had known it would. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and quite possibly new threats to the carefully balanced life they had constructed. But tonight, sitting in the warm comfort of Gryffindor Tower, surrounded by people who cared about his well-being, Harry Potter felt something he was still learning to recognize and trust. He felt hopeful. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it with courage, intelligence, and the knowledge that he was no longer alone in the world. He had family, both chosen and blood, and friends who valued him for his character rather than his fame. He had skills and knowledge that would serve him well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Most importantly, he had learned that truth, however long suppressed, had a remarkable tendency to surface when good people were willing to fight for justice. The wizarding world was about to discover just how much their famous boy who lived had grown during his years away from their attention, and Harry was finally ready to show them exactly who Harry Potter had chosen to become. Flanking them were two ministry auras whose alert postures suggested they were prepared for any resistance the Dursleys might offer, though Harry suspected that his aunt and uncle's capacity for defiance would crumble the moment they understood the full scope of what they faced. But it was Griphook's presence that truly marked how completely the balance of power had shifted. The goblin walked with the measured dignity of someone representing not just Gringotts, but the entire goblin nation's interest in seeing justice done. His formal robes bore symbols that Harry had learned represented ancient treaties and legal authorities that superseded even ministry jurisdiction in matters of inheritance fraud and child abuse. The house at number 4 looked exactly as Harry remembered it, its pristine exterior a perfect mask for the cruelty and neglect that had defined his childhood within its walls. The garden was immaculate, the windows gleamed with Petunia's obsessive attention to appearances, and the overall impression was one of comfortable middle-class respectability that had been purchased with money stolen from the child they had been paid to abuse. As they approached the front door, Harry felt a complex mixture of emotions churning in his chest. There was anger, certainly, a cold fury at the years of unnecessary suffering he had endured, while his aunt and uncle profited from his misery. But there was also something that might have been pity for the pathetic smallness of their ambitions, the way they had sold their souls for suburban comfort and social respectability that would now be stripped away as completely as his childhood had been stolen from him. Bones stepped forward and knocked on the door with the firm authority of someone accustomed to delivering news that would reshape lives. The sound echoed through the house with a finality that seemed to promise that nothing would ever be the same for the Dursley family. The door opened to reveal Petunia Dursley, her thin face arranged in its habitual expression of pinched disapproval. But as her eyes took in the official robes and badges of authority worn by her unexpected visitors, Harry watched her expression shift from irritation to confusion to dawning alarm. "Mrs. Dursley," Bones said, with professional courtesy that carried no warmth whatsoever. "I am Amelia Bones, Director of Magical Law Enforcement. We are here on official business regarding your guardianship of Harry Potter and certain financial irregularities that have come to our attention." Petunia's face went white as she processed what she was hearing, her eyes darting from Bones to the auras to Griphook with growing panic. But it was when her gaze finally settled on Harry himself that her composure cracked completely. "You," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You brought them here. You told them about the arrangements." Harry met her stare with the steady gaze of someone who no longer feared her disapproval or punishment. "I told them about the money you were paid to abuse me, Aunt Petunia. I told them about the theft, the fraud, the systematic betrayal of my parents' wishes. I told them everything." From inside the house came the sound of heavy footsteps, and Vernon Dursley appeared behind his wife like a mountain of righteous indignation. His face was already beginning to turn the familiar purple that had once terrified Harry, but now seemed merely pathetic. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he blustered, his voice carrying all the bluff authority of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "This is private property, and we do not welcome uninvited visitors, especially those involved in your world of freakish nonsense." Bones stepped forward, her presence radiating the kind of calm authority that made Vernon's bluster seem infantile by comparison. "Mr. Dursley, we are here under the authority of both the Ministry of Magic and international treaty obligations to investigate allegations of child abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to violate the legal wishes of deceased magical parents. I suggest you invite us inside, unless you prefer to have this conversation where your neighbors can observe the proceedings." Vernon's eyes darted toward the neighboring houses, and Harry could see him calculating the damage that a public confrontation might do to his carefully cultivated reputation. After a moment of internal struggle, he stepped back from the doorway with obvious reluctance. The living room looked exactly as Harry remembered it. Every piece of furniture positioned with mathematical precision, every surface polished to an unnatural shine that spoke of Petunia's obsessive attention to appearances. But now he could see the room through different eyes, recognizing the expensive electronics and furnishings that represented money stolen from his inheritance being used to fund the Dursleys' comfortable lifestyle. Dudley sat in his usual position in front of the television, his bulk spilling over the edges of a chair that had been purchased to accommodate his expanding form. He looked up at the unexpected visitors with the blank incomprehension of someone whose world had never extended beyond immediate gratification and had no framework for understanding that actions might have consequences. Bones settled into a chair without waiting for an invitation, her movements conveying that this was now her domain, rather than the Dursleys. Griphook took a position near the window, where he could observe the entire family, while the Aurors stationed themselves by the exits in a way that was both subtle and unmistakably purposeful. "Mr. and Mrs. Dursley," Bones began, her voice taking on the formal tone of official proceedings. "You have been receiving payments from the Potter Family Trust for nearly 9 years, ostensibly to cover the costs of caring for your nephew Harry Potter. Our investigation has revealed that these payments totaled approximately 18,000 galleons, which at current exchange rates represents nearly £90,000. Harry watched his aunt and uncle exchange glances that spoke of shared guilt and growing panic. Vernon's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, while Petunia's hands began the nervous wringing motion that Harry remembered from moments of particular stress. "Furthermore," Bones continued, "we have evidence that you were provided with specific instructions regarding Harry's care, education, and general treatment, instructions that you systematically violated while continuing to accept payment for services you never provided." She opened a folder and began reading from documents that Harry recognized as Dumbledore's correspondence with the Dursleys, communications that revealed the true nature of their arrangement. Quote, "It is essential that the boy be kept ignorant of his magical heritage and the circumstances of his parents' death. He must be made to feel unwelcome and dependent, grateful for any kindness when he eventually enters our world. Under no circumstances should he be allowed to develop confidence in his own worth or understanding of his rights and inheritance." Unquote. Vernon's face had progressed beyond purple into territory that suggested his blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. "That," he sputtered, "that is taken completely out of context. We were told that the boy's safety required certain precautions, that his magical nature made him dangerous to normal families." Griphook spoke for the first time since entering the house, his voice carrying the precise diction of someone delivering expert testimony. "Mr. Dursley, we have reviewed every communication between you and the officials who arranged Harry Potter's placement. At no point were you told that he was dangerous. You were explicitly instructed to suppress his magical development and ensure his emotional dependency. You were paid substantial bonuses for exceeding the basic requirements of cruelty and neglect." Petunia made a small, strangled sound that might have been an attempt at denial. "We never wanted him here," she said desperately. "We never asked for this responsibility. We were told it was temporary, that other arrangements would be made when he was older." Bones consulted another document, her expression growing grimmer with each revelation. "According to the financial records, Mrs. Dursley, you were paid extra compensation for what the records describe as maintaining proper isolation protocols and ensuring continued psychological compliance. These payments increased over time as Harry grew older and potentially more difficult to control." Harry felt a sick fascination as he watched the pathetic attempts of his aunt and uncle to justify their actions. They had never loved him, had never wanted him in their home, but they had been willing to accept payment for his suffering and had apparently taken pride in exceeding the minimum requirements for cruelty. What I find particularly disturbing, Bones continued, is evidence that you used Harry as unpaid labor while claiming expenses for his care and maintenance. Neighbors have reported seeing him doing gardening work, house repairs, and general maintenance that would normally require paid contractors, all while he was supposedly being supported by the generous payments you received from his trust fund. Vernon seemed to rally slightly, drawing on reserves of bluster that had served him well in his business dealings with people who lacked the authority to challenge him. "We provided the boy with food and shelter for 9 years, he declared. "We clothed him and gave him a roof over his head, when no one else would take responsibility for his freakish nature. We deserve compensation for the disruption he brought into our peaceful home." Harry stood up from his position near the doorway, feeling the weight of Bones's supportive presence and Griphook's protective authority. For the first time in his life, he was in a position to respond to Vernon's bullying with the truth, backed by evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. "Uncle Vernon," he said quietly, his voice carrying a strength that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including himself. "You kept me in a cupboard under the stairs for 7 years. You fed me table scraps while claiming food expenses that could have supported a family. You denied me medical care, proper clothing, educational materials, and basic human dignity while being paid handsomely to provide all of those things." He stepped closer to his uncle, no longer the frightened child who had cowered under Vernon's rages, but a young man who carried the authority of truth and justice. "You were not providing charity, Uncle Vernon. You were running a profitable business, and your product was my suffering. Every day you made my life a little worse. You were earning money from people who thought they were paying for my welfare." Vernon's bluster finally collapsed entirely, as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his self-righteous anger. The color drained from his face as he realized that his actions were not being judged by neighbors who knew nothing of magical law, but by officials who had documentation of every crime he had committed. "What?" he asked, in a voice that had lost all its previous authority. "What happens to us now?" Bones closed the folder of evidence with movements that suggested this phase of the confrontation was approaching its conclusion. "Under both magical and muggle law, you have committed fraud by accepting payment for services you never provided. You have violated child protection statutes through systematic abuse and neglect, and you have participated in a conspiracy to violate the legal wishes of deceased parents regarding their child's welfare." She paused, allowing the full weight of the charges to settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. "The financial penalties alone will require you to make full restitution of all money received under fraudulent circumstances. Since you almost certainly lack the liquid assets necessary for immediate repayment, this will likely require the sale of your home and possessions." Petunia made a sound that might have been a sob, looking around at the living room that represented everything she had worked to achieve in terms of social respectability and material comfort. All of it had been purchased with money stolen from the nephew she had spent 9 years systematically destroying. Additionally, Bones continued, "Both magical and muggle authorities will be reviewing your case to determine appropriate criminal charges. Child abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and violation of inheritance law are serious crimes that typically result in significant prison sentences." Dudley finally looked up from his television program, his face showing the first glimmering of understanding that the comfortable world his parents had built around him was collapsing. "Mum," he said uncertainly, "what are they talking about? What money?" Harry felt a moment of genuine pity for his cousin, who was still a child and had known nothing about the payments his parents received or the systematic nature of Harry's abuse. Dudley had participated in that abuse, certainly, but he had been following his parents' example rather than acting from his own malice. "Your parents, Dudley," Harry said gently, "have been paid a great deal of money over the years, supposedly to take care of me. Money that was meant to ensure I had everything I needed to grow up healthy and happy. Instead, they used most of it to buy things for themselves, while making sure I understood that I was unwelcome and unwanted. Dudley looked back and forth between his parents and Harry, his face showing confusion and dawning horror as he began to understand the implications of what he was learning. "You mean," he said slowly, "that all the times they said we couldn't afford things for you, they actually had money specifically for taking care of you?" Harry nodded sadly. "Enough money to ensure I had the finest possible care, education, and general treatment. Instead, they kept me in a cupboard and made me wear your cast-off clothing, while telling me I should be grateful for their charity." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock that Harry remembered from countless sleepless nights in his cupboard, listening to the sounds of the family that had never considered him part of their world. Bones stood up, her movement suggesting that the formal interview portion of their visit was complete. "Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, you will be receiving official notifications of the charges being brought against you within the next few days. I strongly recommend that you consult with qualified legal counsel, as the evidence against you is extensive and well documented." She gestured toward Harry, who felt a surge of pride at being included in the official proceedings as a partner rather than simply a victim. "Mr. Potter, is there anything you wish to say to your former guardians before we conclude this matter?" Harry looked around the living room one final time, taking in the expensive furnishings and electronic equipment that represented money stolen from his inheritance, the pristine surfaces that had been maintained while he lived in squalor, the comfortable seating that had been denied to him while he was relegated to his cupboard under the stairs. But more than the material evidence of their betrayal, he saw the three people who had shaped his childhood through systematic cruelty and were now facing the consequences of choices they had made every day for 9 years. "Aunt Petunia, Uncle Vernon," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger or hatred they probably expected. "I hope someday you understand that what you did to me was wrong, not because I was magical or different, but because I was a child who needed love and protection. You had the opportunity to be family to someone who had lost everything, and instead you chose to profit from that loss." He paused, looking directly at each of them in turn. "I do not hate you, because hatred would give you power over me that you no longer deserve. But I also cannot forgive you, because forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and genuine repentance. Until you can honestly confront what you did and why you did it, we have nothing more to say to each other." As they prepared to leave number 4 Privet Drive for what Harry suspected would be the final time, he felt a sense of closure that went beyond mere satisfaction at seeing justice done. The frightened, powerless child who had been shaped by years of systematic abuse had been replaced by someone who understood his own worth and refused to accept treatment that fell short of basic human dignity. The Dursleys would face the consequences of their choices, just as Harry was now free to build the life that his parents had intended for him. The cycle of abuse and manipulation that had defined his first 9 years was finally broken, replaced by relationships based on truth, respect, and genuine care for his welfare. Behind them, the house that had been his prison was already beginning to feel like nothing more than an unpleasant memory, a chapter in his story that was complete and could never again define his understanding of his place in the world. The friend of the Goblin Nation walked away from Privet Drive with his head held high, surrounded by allies who had helped him reclaim not only his inheritance, but his fundamental right to be treated with dignity and respect. The boy who had once hidden in cupboards and apologized for existing had become someone who demanded justice and had the power to achieve it. And somewhere behind him, in a house that would soon be sold to pay restitution for crimes they could no longer deny, 3 people were beginning to understand that their comfortable world of stolen prosperity was collapsing as completely as the childhood they had systematically destroyed. The ancient magic that surrounded Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had never been designed to keep out someone who carried Potter blood, a fact that Harry discovered as he approached the castle's grounds in the pre-dawn darkness with an ease that surprised even him. The wards that should have detected his presence and alerted the castle's occupants seemed to recognize something in his magical signature that granted him passage, as if the very stones of Hogwarts remembered his parents and welcomed their son home. Behind him walked Griphook and two goblin curse-breakers who had volunteered for what they described as the most interesting investigation of their careers. The prospect of uncovering evidence of corruption within Britain's most prestigious magical institution had proven irresistible to goblins who specialized in detecting magical fraud and hidden enchantments. But it was the fourth member of their party who truly marked how completely the balance of magical power had shifted in the weeks since Harry's escape from Privet Drive. Amelia Bones moved through the castle grounds with the quiet authority of someone conducting an official investigation, her presence backed by emergency warrants that granted her access to any location within Hogwarts that might contain evidence relevant to Harry's case. The castle itself was largely empty during the summer holidays, with most of the faculty departed for research or travel, and the corridors that normally echoed with student voices now wrapped in the kind of silence that made even whispered conversations seem like intrusions. But Harry knew that not all of Hogwarts' occupants had departed for the summer, and he was particularly interested in confronting one resident who had spent years claiming ignorance of his true circumstances. The headmaster's office was exactly as Harry had imagined it would be, a circular chamber filled with the accumulated magical artifacts and scholarly detritus of someone who had spent decades collecting symbols of power and knowledge. Ancient instruments whose purposes Harry could not fathom lined the walls, while portraits of former headmasters pretended to sleep in their frames, their painted eyes occasionally flickering open to observe the unexpected intrusion. But it was the desk at the center of the room that drew Harry's attention, its surface covered with correspondence and documents that suggested Dumbledore's summer had been spent in frantic damage control as the investigation into his crimes gained momentum. Letters bearing official seals lay scattered among what appeared to be financial records and legal briefs, the detritus of a man whose carefully constructed reputation was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence. Griphook moved to the desk with the professional efficiency of someone who had spent years investigating financial crimes, his trained eyes cataloguing potential evidence with methodical precision. Magical contracts, he murmured to his goblin colleagues, pointing toward a stack of parchment that seemed to pulse with its own internal magic, and correspondence with ministry officials that appears to discuss ongoing attempts to minimize the political damage from Mr. Potter's revelations. Harry felt a surge of satisfaction at the evidence that Dumbledore's comfortable world was being shaken by the truth, but his primary focus remained on finding the person who had orchestrated his childhood suffering. According to their intelligence, the headmaster rarely left the castle even during summer holidays, preferring to conduct his various schemes from the security of his private domain. But a thorough search of the office and the adjacent private quarters revealed no sign of Dumbledore himself, only the accumulated evidence of someone whose multiple conspiracies were finally catching up with him. Harry was beginning to wonder if the headmaster had fled to the country when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside, accompanied by a voice that he recognized from years of hushed conversations between Vernon and Petunia. Professor McGonagall entered the office with the brisk efficiency that Harry associated with teachers everywhere. But her expression shifted from irritation to shock, to something that might have been recognition as she took in the unexpected scene before her. "Good Lord," she breathed, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced as her composure slipped. "Harry Potter, after all these years of wondering, of trying to get information about your welfare, here you are in the flesh." She looked around at the goblins and Amelia Bones, clearly trying to process the implications of their presence in what should have been a secure location. "Director Bones," she said, with growing understanding, "this is an official investigation, is it not? You have finally been given permission to examine Albus's role in the boy's placement and care. Harry stepped forward, studying the woman who had apparently been one of the few adults to express concern about his welfare over the years. "Professor McGonagall," he said carefully, "I have read your letters to Dumbledore, the ones where you demanded to be allowed to check on my circumstances and ensure that I was receiving appropriate care and education." McGonagall's face crumpled with an emotion that might have been relief, mixed with long-suppressed guilt. "Oh, my dear boy," she said softly, "I tried so many times to get information about you, to arrange visits, to ensure that you were being properly prepared for your magical education. But Albus always had excuses, reasons why such contact would be dangerous or premature." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, taking on the tone of someone who had been carrying the weight of unexpressed concerns for years. "The reports I received through my own channels suggested that you were not receiving the care and attention that any magical child deserves, let alone one with your particular circumstances and heritage. But whenever I raised these concerns, I was told that I was interfering in delicate arrangements that I could not possibly understand." Bones stepped forward, her expression carrying the professional interest of someone gathering testimony from a potentially crucial witness. "Professor McGonagall," she said formally, "we are investigating allegations of systematic fraud, child abuse, and violation of inheritance law in connection with Mr. Potter's placement and care. Your insights regarding the internal discussions and decision-making processes at Hogwarts could be extremely valuable to our case." McGonagall looked around the office with an expression that suggested she was seeing it through new eyes, recognizing for the first time the evidence of corruption and conspiracy that had apparently been hidden in plain sight for years. "What specifically do you need to know?" she asked, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to providing clear, factual testimony. Griphook consulted a file that contained what appeared to be official correspondence between Hogwarts and the Ministry of Magic. "Professor McGonagall, our investigation has revealed that substantial payments were made from Mr. Potter's trust fund, ostensibly for his magical education and preparation for Hogwarts attendance. Were you aware that such payments were being made? And if so, what educational services were provided in exchange for these funds?" McGonagall's face went white as she processed the implications of the question. "Educational payments," she repeated slowly, "from Harry's own trust fund. I was never informed of any such arrangements, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no educational services of any kind were provided to the boy during his time with the Dursleys." She moved to one of the filing cabinets that lined the office walls, her movements suggesting familiarity with the organization system that governed Hogwarts administrative records. "As deputy headmistress, I am responsible for tracking the educational progress of all students prior to their formal admission to Hogwarts. I maintain detailed files on every magical child in Britain, documenting their development, their early signs of magical ability, and their preparation for formal magical education." She opened one of the drawers and withdrew a file that bore Harry's name, its contents disappointingly thin compared to the thick folders that surrounded it. "This is everything we have on record regarding Harry Potter's pre-Hogwarts development," she said grimly. "A birth certificate, documentation of his parents' death, and the formal guardianship transfer signed by Albus. Beyond that, nothing." Harry felt a chill as he realized the implications of what McGonagall was showing them. There should have been regular progress reports, assessments of his magical development, documentation of the educational support that the trust fund payments were supposedly providing. Instead, there was evidence of systematic neglect disguised as protection. "You said that Dumbledore claimed my contact with the magical world would be dangerous," Harry said, his voice carefully controlled. "What reasons did he give for keeping me isolated from everyone who might have provided support or guidance?" McGonagall's expression grew thoughtful as she apparently revisited years of conversations and explanations that she had accepted at the time, but which now seemed questionable in light of new information. "Albus spoke frequently about the unique dangers you faced due to your survival of the killing curse," she said slowly. He claimed that your location needed to remain secret to protect you from remaining followers of you-know-who might seek revenge. He also suggested that exposure to magical society too early might interfere with the protective enchantments that had saved your life. She paused, her academic mind clearly working through the logical inconsistencies that she had previously overlooked. But looking back on those explanations now, I realize that many of his concerns could have been addressed through proper precautions rather than complete isolation. There was no reason why you could not have received magical tutoring in secure locations, or why trusted members of our community could not have been allowed to assess your welfare. Amelia Bones made notes on parchment that seemed to write itself, documenting testimony that could prove crucial in demonstrating the systematic nature of the conspiracy that had shaped Harry's childhood. "Professor McGonagall," she said carefully, "were there other faculty members who expressed concerns about Mr. Potter's placement and care? And if so, how were those concerns addressed by the headmaster?" McGonagall's expression grew grimmer as she considered the question, apparently recalling conversations and incidents that had seemed minor at the time, but which now appeared significant in the context of an ongoing investigation. "Professor Flitwick raised questions about Harry's magical education on several occasions," she said slowly. "As did Professor Sprout, particularly after she heard rumors about his living conditions from contacts in the non-magical world. Professor Snape, surprisingly, also expressed concerns, though his were more focused on ensuring that Harry would be adequately prepared for the academic rigors of Hogwarts. But whenever such concerns were raised, Harry prompted, 'What happened?' McGonagall's face took on the expression of someone who was finally understanding the significance of events she had previously dismissed as administrative routine. Albus would schedule private meetings with each faculty member who had expressed concerns, she said slowly. Afterward, they would seem satisfied that appropriate arrangements were in place and would stop asking questions about your welfare. The implications of what she was describing sent chills down Harry's spine as he began to understand the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation. The headmaster had not simply hidden Harry away and hoped that no one would ask questions. He had systematically silenced every adult who might have provided support or oversight, using methods that left them believing their concerns had been addressed. "Professor McGonagall," Griphook said, with the careful precision of someone who specialized in uncovering magical fraud, "would you be willing to submit to a magical oath regarding the accuracy of your testimony? Such an oath would provide additional weight to your statements and help establish the credibility of your observations." McGonagall straightened to her full height, her expression taking on the fierce determination that had made her one of Hogwarts' most respected professors. "I would be honored to provide such an oath," she said firmly. "What Albus has done to this boy, the way he has betrayed the trust placed in him as an educator and protector of children, it represents a violation of everything we are supposed to stand for as a school and as a magical community." As the formal oath was administered and McGonagall's testimony was recorded with all appropriate magical authentication, Harry felt a profound sense of validation. Here was an adult who had genuinely cared about his welfare, who had tried to ensure his protection and proper development, but who had been systematically deceived and manipulated by the man who was supposed to be the ultimate authority on matters of student welfare and safety. But McGonagall's testimony also raised disturbing questions about the other faculty members who had expressed concerns about Harry's placement. If they had been satisfied by private meetings with Dumbledore, if their questions had been silenced through methods that left no obvious evidence of coercion, what did that suggest about the headmaster's capabilities and methods? "Professor McGonagall," Harry asked carefully, "do you remember anything specific about the faculty members' behavior after their private meetings with Dumbledore? Did they seem like themselves, or was there anything that suggested their concerns had been addressed through means other than simple reassurance?" McGonagall frowned as she considered the question, her expression suggesting that she was examining memories with new understanding of their potential significance. "Now that you mention it," she said slowly. There were certain oddities. Professor Flitwick, for instance, seemed to have no memory of his previous concerns when I tried to discuss them with him later, and Professor Sprout appeared confused when I referenced conversations we had previously had about your welfare, as if she could not quite recall what had prompted her initial questions. The room fell silent, as everyone present processed the implications of what McGonagall was describing. If Dumbledore had been using memory charms or other forms of mental manipulation on his own faculty, the scope of his crimes extended far beyond theft and child abuse into territory that challenged the fundamental trust relationships that held magical society together. Griphook exchanged meaningful glances with his goblin colleagues, clearly recognizing that they had uncovered evidence of criminal activity that went to the very heart of magical education and institutional authority. Professor McGonagall, Bones said grimly, I believe we may need to arrange for magical medical examinations of the other faculty members you mentioned. If there is evidence of unauthorized memory modification or other forms of mental manipulation, such crimes represent serious violations of wizarding law that carry severe penalties. As their investigation of Dumbledore's office continued, Harry found himself examining the accumulated artifacts and documents with new understanding of their significance. What he had initially seen as the scholarly collection of an accomplished wizard now appeared to be the tools and records of someone whose schemes extended far beyond the simple theft of money from a child's trust fund. There were correspondence with international officials that suggested Dumbledore had been manipulating political processes across multiple countries. There were research notes about magical techniques that seemed designed to influence or control human behavior. There were financial records that documented payments to individuals and organizations whose purposes were not immediately clear, but which appeared to involve significant sums of money. Most disturbing of all were the personal files that contained detailed information about students, faculty, and ministry officials, complete with assessments of their psychological vulnerabilities and suggestions for how they might be influenced or controlled to serve Dumbledore's purposes. Harry stared at his own file, which was considerably thicker than McGonagall's records had suggested it should be, filled with observations and plans that made his blood run cold with their calculated manipulation of his emotional and psychological development. Subject shows strong tendency toward guilt and self-sacrifice, one entry read, dating from shortly after his parents' death. Recommend continued isolation and emotional deprivation to enhance gratitude for eventual acceptance into magical society. Natural leadership instincts must be carefully channeled to serve larger strategic objectives rather than personal ambition. Another entry, dated several years later, was even more chilling in its cold assessment of Harry as a resource to be managed rather than a child to be protected. Subject's placement with hostile relatives producing desired psychological profile, strong need for approval, willingness to accept dangerous assignments, tendency to prioritize others' welfare above personal safety. Recommend continued monitoring and gradual introduction of challenging scenarios to test subject's willingness to sacrifice himself for perceived greater good. Harry felt sick as he realized that every aspect of his suffering had been carefully calculated and monitored, that his pain and isolation had been deliberately maintained to shape him into someone who could be manipulated and controlled when the time came for him to serve Dumbledore's purposes. But perhaps most devastating of all was a recent entry that revealed the ultimate purpose behind years of systematic abuse and manipulation. Subject now approaching optimal psychological state for final phase of operation. 9 years of carefully managed trauma have produced individual who will willingly sacrifice himself when presented with appropriate motivation. Recommend activation of contingency plans to ensure subject's compliance with ultimate objective. Destruction of remaining Horcrux through subject's own death, thereby eliminating both Dark Lord and potential rival for magical authority. The words seemed to blur together as Harry tried to process what he was reading. The casual discussion of his planned murder disguised as strategic planning for the greater good. Dumbledore had not simply stolen his inheritance or condemned him to years of abuse. He had been systematically preparing Harry for death, shaping his personality and psychology to ensure that when the time came, he would willingly walk to his own execution. Griphook appeared at Harry's shoulder, his sharp eyes taking in the contents of the file with professional assessment of their legal and strategic significance. "Mr. Potter," he said quietly, "this document represents evidence of premeditated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and what our legal system would classify as the most serious violations of magical law regarding the protection of children. Combined with the financial crimes and abuse we have already documented, these charges could result in life imprisonment in Azkaban." Harry nodded numbly, still struggling to process the scope of Dumbledore's betrayal. It was one thing to discover that the man had stolen money and arranged for his abuse. It was quite another to learn that every moment of his suffering had been deliberately orchestrated to prepare him for a death that would serve someone else's political objectives. But as the initial shock began to wear off, Harry felt something else building in his chest. A cold, focused anger that was entirely different from the helpless rage he had experienced as a child. This was the anger of someone who had been wronged, and now possessed both the evidence and the allies necessary to seek justice. As they prepared to leave Dumbledore's office, with evidence that would reshape the magical world's understanding of institutional corruption and child abuse, Harry took one last look around the chamber that had been the command center for the conspiracy that had stolen his childhood. The portraits of former headmasters watched their departure with expressions that suggested they understood the significance of what had been discovered. The magical instruments that had once seemed mysterious and impressive now appeared to be tools of surveillance and control. And the desk that had been the site of so many decisions affecting Harry's welfare was now simply empty furniture in a room that would soon be sealed as a crime scene. Professor McGonagall walked with them as they made their way through the castle corridors, her presence a reminder that not all of Hogwarts' faculty had been complicit in the conspiracy that had shaped Harry's life. "Mr. Potter," she said softly as they approached the castle's main entrance, "I want you to know that when you do come to Hogwarts as a student, you will find people here who genuinely care about your welfare and your success. What Albus did, the way he betrayed his responsibilities as an educator and protector, that does not represent the values or intentions of everyone who serves this institution." Harry nodded gratefully, understanding that McGonagall's support would be crucial in the difficult months ahead as the magical world grappled with the revelations about their most respected leader. As they walked away from Hogwarts in the early morning light, Harry felt the same sense of forward momentum that had carried him from Privet Drive to this moment of ultimate revelation. He had come to the castle seeking evidence of Dumbledore's crimes, and had found proof of betrayal that exceeded his worst fears. But he had also found allies like McGonagall, who had genuinely tried to protect him, evidence that not everyone in the magical world had been complicit in his suffering. Most importantly, he had found documentation that would make it impossible for even Dumbledore's most powerful supporters to dismiss or minimize the crimes that had been committed. The friend of the Goblin Nation walked away from Hogwarts with evidence that would bring down the most powerful wizard in Britain, surrounded by allies who had helped him uncover the truth about his past and were committed to ensuring justice for his future. Behind them, the castle stood silent in the morning light, its ancient stones holding secrets that had finally been brought into the harsh glare of justice.